Testing. Jack, would you say a few words into the mic?
Sure. It's always a pleasure to talk to such a beautiful young lady. When I'm mad at you for locking my baby up at home, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're such a sweet baby. Now see what it sounds like.
All right, we'll see what it sounds like. Stop.
Tell me the way that thing works. It shouldn't jump like that, but I guess
it should jump like
should it?
That. It's supposed to touch. See,
no, I mean
now, go and talk, honey.
I think that's better. Who's that good-looking little lady over here from Oregon, huh? Hi.
Hi, George.
How are you, Mary?
Hi.
How's that?
Well,
We're sure glad to have you down here tonight. Don't you look wonderful?
This is really a treat to be here. Believe
No.
me. I
Why,
just couldn't appreciate it more.
You know what makes her look so sweet is those wonderful Oregon strawberries, isn't
Oh, those canned strawberries.
Let's see. Now, Madeline says she records a lot deeper.
Well, my voice always comes out a lot deeper.
Don't hurry, we're going to be here.
I don't know why.
We're liable to be, too, by golly. How about Pauline here? He will be, too, huh?
Well, you better write your address on your cuff so we know where to take you to if you're going to take those.
Well, just lay us out on
Just lay us out for the pool. You know, oddly enough, the last time we were down, till 4 o'clock in the morning, we were entertained by a group of college kids. When was that we were down here, Madeline? I never heard such something in the whole blue of my life. We had one of the lower rooms over here. It sounded like they'd get all in the bed and jump on the floor. And I talked to the desk about the next morning. We were going to call, and I thought, oh, hell, I won't be a kill shot. He said took all the cops in the place to keep those kids in order, and then they didn't do any good.
Each one will record for an hour. You record an hour, and then
on a
you
week's
turn it over and
vacation at
record the
Easter.
other side.
That's what it was. It was just before Easter.
Are you recording now?
Yes.
So, I think some of those boys needed their name on their cuff, all right. They were throwing beer balls in the swimming pool. Don't you remember that here?
No, I've only been here a short time.
Yeah, well,
Well, it's just a couple of weeks ago.
just before Easter. They were on their Easter vacation, these kids. Did you get Jack, Madeline? How about you?
Oh, yeah, we're
Well,
all on it. You're getting
I
Get
don't know
Pauline
what to
here.
say.
How about getting Pauline? Hey.
Pauline?
I have nothing to
Tell
say.
us how old you are and where you're born.
I was born in Missouri and I'm 16.
All right. We heard that too. We know.
Tell us the secret of how you keep your youth.
Well, I fib about it. I keep it.
Well, that's a good way. Murray, where were you born? How old are you?
Oh, I was born in Oregon and I'm only 18, you know.
Oh, wonderful.
I
Oh,
thought Murray
young
was
girl.
14, right?
And where were you born, and how old are you?
I was born in Arizona.
How old are you?
I come here.
You forgot.
I was 987.
And you, where were you born?
I was born in Iowa, and they didn't keep records in them days, so nobody knows how old I am.
Old man to the mountain.
Sure enough.
Well.
Now, let's see what works. For God's sake, let's hope this writes off.
See, where if you get this, and you want to have a system outside, you have to get a separate.
This has got to.
Right?
Now, this. Does this make a loud noise outside? Can they hear me? Is that the idea? What do you mean?
As long as you're behind it to where this doesn't come out and hit your microphone.
For instance, you can take this other wire. You put this outside.
Yeah, and you need a long wire.
You want a wire into your radio. Right?
What's that roar I just heard there then? What was that?
Plug in the other speaker.
Oh, I see. You plugged it in there.
So you can attach this to our hi-fi at home. Put this thing outside, and this plays outside from our record player.
Now, is this a current model here, Mr. Rudy?
This is the latest Ampro. They've kept the same model for 2 years. They've made no changes in it
Uh-huh.
at all, other than in your front grill here.
Uh-huh.
It's held up.
Oh, now, let's see. These gadgets here. Now, what's that?
You're getting your mic too close to here.
Oh, I see.
You're getting feedback.
Uh-huh.
Keep your volume down.
Let's say record.
Yeah,
Forward. Stop.
Now, Martha, give the boys all the eggs they can eat now.
Held up one finger. No, let's keep it going a minute. You know, I might precede this dinner with a little remark that nobody's going to have to listen to any speeches. If anybody's going to give any talks, it's going to be Rube, Neil, or Joe Pearce, or Jack.
Say grace.
But nobody else is going to be allowed to give a talk tonight, so it's all going to be very informal. But the thing that we did want to do is to have a recording of some of the stories that passed by here tonight, because they probably will never be duplicated, and no one in Arizona has any knowledge of these stories.
By the way, what is this occasion?
What is this occasion? Well, this is, I guess, the first annual get-together of the surviving members of the Arizona Rangers. I don't know when it began. It began in the early years long in the 1870s or 1880s. We'll find the exact date a little later on. But at the moment, we are honored by having 3 of the surviving 92 members of the Arizona Rangers with us tonight. It's a very happy occasion for all of us. We're honored also by having Mrs. D.L. Bouse down here, that little girl, the first white child who was born where?
Born in England, and the first white child to go to school in Morenci.
First white child who went to school in Morenci. I understand she's very precocious and head of the class all the way through, and there's her nice husband, D.L. Bouse, down there. Here's old Moika Christie, Moika Manuel now down in the next seat, and then next to her's that good-looking commissioner of ours, Warren Peterson. We're fortunate to have the little strawberry lady from Oregon, Mrs. Jack Dodd, joining her. And then right to my wife, I have my charming little wife, Madeline, here, who's a little New Orleans girl. If any ever get hungry, come on up to Oak Creek sometime. She'll cook a New Orleans supper for you. It's really good. Then we have Joe Pearce to the right, who's from Eager, and he's come all the way down, and he's driven his own car. And Joe is, I'll let you in on a secret, Joe is 39 years old, aren't you, Joe? And then we have Rube Neal. Then we have Rube Neal, whom I revered when I was a kid. I used to hear the name Rube Neal. He was an officer who protected us and made us all safe for humanity and protected us from all harm and evil. And we're lucky to have Mrs. Peterson and Mike's very nice husband, Dr. Manuel, here. And Mr. Dodd, who is the gentleman has these fabulous cameras and also the ability to know how to use them. Jack Dodd is, I think, going to contribute a great deal to this party tonight. But this is, I say, a very informal little supper. The only thing I'll demand out of tonight is that I would like to say grace, and that's all I ask. And it's going to be a very short one. But along in the evening, we're going to have some of these stories as it works out. But the main thing is a spirit of fellowship and camaraderie and reliving the old times when possibly the location of this particular holiday house, what is it called, a highway house, or where we were having our dinner, was part of a, I guess it was a cattle range, wasn't it? It couldn't have been a sheep pasture, could it, Rube?
Well,
Ah. What was it, Jack?
they drilled an oil well right here.
Oh, they drilled an oil well here. Well, the guy that's got the top of the ground made most of the money, but we'll go on here in a very informal fashion, and I hope everybody enjoys
Mr.
itself.
Babbitt, let me say a word, will you please?
Go ahead, Joe. Sure, all yours.
There's something very strange that about the stories these Arizona Rangers tell. No one seems to know anything about it but them.
What do I think about that, Joe? Do you I guess nobody knows what your stories are except you fellas.
I don't think there's anything strange about that. Two of us were here to hear them.
Like you say.
Joe, you can tell them anything you want, but you won't. I know.
So what's the number on your bed?
You just hold up your hand and
What number?
Johnny and I'll fire to it.
13.
13. Well, that's been a lucky number, hasn't
That's
it?
my lucky number.
It certainly has. Would you care something to drink?
But Joe, while we're for the supper to come in, I thought maybe we could have a little get-together. I know it's a wonderful opportunity to have you and Rube and Jack here. It's the majority of the Arizona Rangers visiting with us for supper tonight. While we're waiting for that the little sirloin steak that we've ordered. I hope it's a good one, too, by the way.
Well, I hope so. I think we come to judges.
Well, if you're not, I don't know who would be.
Hap and I worked together, and he was warden as
All right, I'm sure that you wouldn't mind talking to us for a minute, but
Riley. I know
as 3 of the 5 living Arizona Rangers out of 92 or 93, I'm not quite sure about the number. 91. Of 91 Arizona Rangers, you represent 3 of the 5 living Arizona Rangers. I thought it'd be interesting to go into some of the history that went into your activities, and I noticed that you have a number 13 badge on your lapel. Now, that was the old Arizona Ranger badge, wasn't it? That was issued to you when you went into the Rangers?
Well, he always was.
Yes.
Number 13?
Number 13. That's the number.
Now, how did you happen to get into the Arizona Rangers, Joe?
Well, I'll tell you, I was seeking adventure. I was young, and I'd rode with the old hash knife outfit at Holbrook, and I was in Holbrook when they brought in the first trainload of cattle from the panhandle of Texas.
When was that, Joe?
It was 1885. And I rode with the boys, and I learned to speak the language of the Texas cowboy. And they were fine fellows to work with, but they were hard men. They were pretty hard characters.
What was their language, Joe? Mostly their 45 or something sort?
More on the order of 45 than anything else. My language. That's the language the boys spoke, and the hash knife boys thought that they were told that they were coming into a frontier country about the time Geronimo was operating, and they came in well armed to defend themselves. And they brought in a bunch of gunmen with them to keep down cattle rustling and to keep sheep off the range. There was probably 150,000 head of sheep running on the hash knife range at the time. Well, I say I was seeking adventure, and there was a lot of cattle rustling going on in Arizona at the time, and they'd swipe Daddy's cattle. They got off, the rustlers had with about 100 head of cattle, and I didn't feel just right about that.
Where was your daddy's outfit, and what was your daddy's name? May I interject?
My daddy was James Pearce, and we had a ranch right over near Heber, on Pierce Wash, near Heber. And right where the members who were participating in the Pleasant Valley War would come by and stop with my father, and I got acquainted with the Tewksbury's and the Grahams, and also many others who took part in that Pleasant Valley War. Well, as I say, I was seeking adventure, and there was an opportunity after one of our rangers, after the Arizona Rangers had a fight with the Smith brothers on Black River, and 2 of our boys were killed. I just enlisted to fill the gap.
You mean your boys? Was that your father's cowboys that were killed?
No, the Rangers, 2 Rangers were killed who had a fight with the Smith brothers on Black River, outlaws.
Oh, I see.
And 2 of our boys were killed, Carlos Tafoya and Bill Maxim. Well, I had an opportunity to fill the gap there, so I enlisted in the Arizona Rangers.
How old were you then, Joe?
About 28, something like that. And I was called to Douglas. The headquarters of the Arizona Rangers were then in Douglas. Captain Mossman established his headquarters in Bisbee. And when Captain Reining took command, Captain Reining was one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. He was a lieutenant in the Rough Riders and was active in the Battle of Los Guasimas and helped take San Juan Hill and was right close to Bucky O'Neill, the famous Bucky of Prescott, when he was killed. He was standing right near him. Well, as I say, there was an opening to go in, and I had no star at the time. And Ranger Billy Webb, he had just killed a man by the name of, he killed an outlaw by the name of Bass. He was a brother of the notorious Sam Bass of Texas that the Texas Rangers wiped out.
Where was it that he'd killed Sam Bass?
Well, he killed Bass in Douglas.
Uh-huh.
And nobody, I had no star when I enlisted in the company, And after Billy Webb killed Bass, Billy Webb was wearing star number 13. And I had it in my head that was really certainly an unlucky number. So the captain came over to headquarters one morning. He says, Joe, he says, you haven't a star. And he says, how about taking Billy Webb's number 13? And there was about 8 or 9 Arizona Rangers in the building, in the headquarters, and the boys raised up and they began to shake their head. They never said anything. They began to shake their head and move their head. No, don't do it. And I said, well, Cap, I says, how about putting it off until tomorrow? Let me think it over a little bit. So that night, I paced down in Douglas, and there was an old lady there, a lady there. She was, she could pretend to read the past and the future of anyone, and I handed her $1, and I told her that I had lined up with a gang of gun toters, and I wondered if that'd be a lucky or an unlucky number. Well, she asked me my age and what I'd followed, and I told her, and she says, now, young man, she says, don't pay any attention to that old English adage that if a cat runs across the railroad track at night, it means a wreck. She said, there's nothing to that. You go ahead and wear star number 13, and it'll be luck to you. And it was. I wore it through the year's service that I had, and if it hadn't have been luck to me,
Joe,
I wouldn't have been here to told you about the Arizona Rangers.
Good. When was it you went into the Rangers? What year was that? Remember?
About 1902, wasn't it, Rube? About
22, Joe.
1902,
that's right.
1902.
Yeah.
May I interject myself? What did you get in the way of salary when you became a Ranger?
We were paid $100 a month, and that looked like a gold mine to us, and we boarded ourselves, and we had to keep a pack mule and a good saddle horse, and had to feed them for $100 a month, and cover all the territory of Arizona. Not one place. We worked on the border usually until we were educated a little bit to the duties of a ranger, and I might state, Mr. Babbitt, briefly what the qualifications were to enlist for a ranger to Arizona Rangers would be enough.
The good thing we got Madeline here.
Good thing you have your mechanic along. You start. It's going.
Well, I just want to. No. We were talking a little bit about the early days of cattle company. We were waiting for that so-called state to come out here. All right, Rube. What the dickens were we talking about here a minute ago before we interrupted? Rube, Neil, come on, tell us now. We were talking about how the Hashknights lost some of the cattle and how some other people wound up with a nice little outfit, so to speak.
Well, the Hashknife Cattle Company was created in Texas, incorporated under Texas law, and most of the cattle came from what is known as the Seawell. It's on a little railroad that goes down. They call it GT&W, or get a ticket and walk, is what they call the road that's done.
Where was this now, Rube? The GT&W?
Well, it went down the bottom of the Brazos River. And
it's over in Texas, right?
Yes, GH and SA was another road that went into that country. The ones that was cattle were shipped out, and the train men call that GH and SA, they call it go high and set them all. The brakeman did, you know, because it's about there. But there's where the Hashknife Cattle Company originated. And they were mostly financed by Brooks. Brooks put in the most of the money. He was for the old A&P Railroad. And they had this range. The state or the territory of Arizona granted every alternate section 40 miles each way from the SP, or from the A&P rather, in order to get them to build the road. So they owned this land, the railroad company did, and Brooks got the land from the company and stocked it up with hash knife cattle. And I had a brother-in-law that came with him, worked with him, and I had a friend that were on one of the wagons by the name of U.Z. Rand. They told me there were 38,000 cattle shipped in. Well, they claim the record showed something around 16,000 heads they shipped out. Now, a good deal of that was due to drought. It was bad, if you remember, along in those years, we had a spell, and it was for 7 or 8 years that people just gradually went broke on account of not having any range for their stock. But these cattle, most of them, well, your uncle bought a good many of them.
Uncle Bill?
Yes, and he turned them loose around Garden City and Dodge City, back on that prairie country where the rivers come down out of Colorado. He had a range in there.
Rube, may I ask you something? You talk about these cattle. What kind of cattle were they?
Well, they were white-faced and a longhorn mixed. They were, they weren't as big. They wouldn't get as heavy as the cattle do at the present time. They were all right, nice cattle. But
what was the Durham cattle you heard about in the early days?
Well, they weren't any Durham. The Durham cattle wasn't good range stock. They weren't good rustlers. They were more or less milk stock. And that is, they required a great deal of care, more attention. The whiteface is a good rustler, you know.
Oh, were they longhorns?
No, they were the Durhams. They was what they call hard-faced Durham, and then the roan Durham cattle. And
let's get back to these Texas cattle that come in. They were white-faced cattle?
Yes, they're all white-faced.
Were they longhorn cattle?
Well, yes, much longer than they are to present date, but they weren't really the longhorn. Longhorn cattle at that time were almost extinct. There were just a few around on ranges, and more or less under a fence. But they were a mixture. These cattle were a mixture of the white face and the longhorn.
Were they all a solid color?
Yes, mostly red with white face.
Were they pretty wild, pretty snaky?
Well, no, they were inclined to get wild. You turn them loose without enough attention or handle them a little rough, they'd get wild very easily.
What did you do? Did you turn them off the range? They're pretty thin, weren't they? You'd sell them to Eastern outfits that would fatten them, or how?
Well, at that time, the hash knives had some nice range. Now, one instance, you know what they call Cool Mountain, or what they call Meteor Mountain. There's Cool Mountain then. When I was a boy, I went to one roundup. They cut 23 cars of cattle out of one roundup and put them right on the Los Angeles market. They were all beef. And the grass was half as high as this table, Saskatoon grass.
You know, the grass is almost 2.5, 3 feet high, huh?
Yes. And now a barn rat couldn't get his breakfast on a good part of that country. It's just worn out.
A what?
A barn rat, I say, it's worn out.
Oh, now?
Yes, now. But at that time, it was a beautiful country.
Well, what is the difference between the early day cattle and the cattle we have nowadays? Of course, we know what these Herefords are, these white faces, and so on and so forth. How many hands high? How big were your cattle when you had them?
Well, to take a good sized steer at that time weighed 1,000 pounds to 1,100 pounds, and now the average, turn him off a beef here, the average steer will go around 12.50 if he's had any kind of care at all. At that time, you'd take and ship several carloads of cattle. They probably wouldn't average much over 800 pounds. That would be a fair average for them.
Tell me another thing. I've heard them talk about the old timers. How far would a steer have to go to water in the early days?
Well, 34 miles. I remember of seeing there's a Bucky O'Neill run a paper he called the Hoof and Horn, and he edited it in Prescott.
Yeah.
And see, there was a man in that country, he's Sullivan, Jerry Sullivan.
Yeah.
He had quite a few cattle, and his cattle, they had to look in this paper of Bucky's, and he had an ad in there, and there his cattle was riding the velocipede to water. There was a string of them come along in the paper, and that was show.
The thing was, Rube, that they had to go 3 or 4 miles for water, and then they had to go back 3 or 4 miles to get
to grass. Yes.
In other words, the reason they had to go that 3 or 4 miles for water is because they had no grass.
Well, they eat the range off naturally. You take cattle are lazy. They're not like a horse. They'll lay down, eat. A horse will keep eating. And the cow, when they get their appetite satisfied, they lay down and sleep. But they'll stay around water holes to avoid traveling till they deplete the range, and then they'll gradually move out from the water. And that's why a lot of the range is depleted.
Well, you know, Rube, we were talking about the hash knives and the big operation they had. I understand there was an awful lot of rustling went on. You were a law officer down there in those days.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
Yes, there was lots of rustling. They brought in a bunch of, we call them rawhide artists. They'd take any brand that you could put on an animal, and they'd figure out some way to change it into another brand. And lots of natives here wasn't accustomed to that, never gave it any thought, and when they woke up, they were pretty well robbed by the time they found out these fellows could do that kind of work.
In other words, they thought they had a lot of cattle running their brand, and the rawhiders came in and took it over.
And when they come along, now there's, for instance, you could take the hash knife. There's a man came into the country by the name of Bawley Martin, and the hash knife, you know, and they did a kiss. He just made the circle out of the top of that hash knife and run another cross through it and put a bar under it.
What did he call that brand?
H.O. Cross. That's what they called it. Well, he had about, he got off several hundred head of hash knife cattle before. And, of course, they had men along with them, men that if they'd wanted to protect them.
And Johnny Palmer there.
Yes, they knew how to do this. They brought the idea into the country, but they wasn't about to stop anybody, because that's what they came, most of them came here for, to rustle off the hash knives.
And the hash knives lost a lot of cattle because of rustling.
Oh, yes. Yes, they did. They lost. But they was heavy loss.
They're the ones that brought that tying the ropes behind the saddle into the country.
Oh, yeah. Top of the hash knife and run another cross through it and put a bar under it.
What did he call that brand?
H.O. Cross. That's what they called it. Well, he had about, he got off several hundred head of hash knife cattle before. And, of course, they had men along with them, men that if they'd wanted to protect them.
And Johnny Palmer there.
Yes, they knew how to do this. They brought the idea into the country, but they wasn't about to stop anybody, because that's what they came, most of them came here for, to rustle off the hash knives.
And the hash knives lost a lot of cattle because of rustling.
Oh, yes. Yes, they did. They lost. But they was heavy loss.
They're the ones that brought that tying the ropes behind the saddle.
Good morning, folks. This is Tuesday morning, April the 30th, 1957. I don't believe that's recording, is it? Yeah. And we're continuing with our discussion of the early days of the Arizona Rangers. And we have with us again this morning Rube Neal, and Joe Pearce, and Jack Redmond. Last night, Rube and I were talking about the early days in the livestock business of Flagstaff. You mentioned the Daggs brothers came out of the picture. They're the gentlemen who were reputed to have been the factor that began the Graham-Tewksbury feud. I guess there's no one living who knows more about the Pleasant Valley War and the Daggs brothers and other circumstances surrounding this historic event than the three gentlemen we have here this morning. Rube, I imagine in your early days up in the northern end of the state, you came into pretty close contact with the Daggs boys, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
What were they, sheep men?
Yes, there were 5 brothers. They was Piru, Averill, Jack, Frank, and Bob. They're all educated, well educated. Bob was a lawyer, and the others were accountants. And they came to Flagstaff and engaged in the sheep business under the firm name of Daggs Brothers.
I didn't know there were 5 of them, Rube. I always thought there were just 2. I don't know.
No, there were 5. I knew them all personally. Well.
And they started out with a sheep outfit that ran its stock around Flagstaff vicinity?
Well, they were around Anderson Mason, Hay Lake, and Beasley Tanks. That's in just about west of Winslow, and out on the Hay Lake country, what's known as the Hay Lake and Jack Canyon Range.
You remember what their brands were?
No, they had wool brands on their sheep.
Yeah.
I don't know what they were.
What kind of sheep did they run?
Well, they were what the Mexicans at that time called pelonas. They were a very poor grade of sheep. And the word would indicate that they had a very light wool crop. Very poor grade of sheep.
I guess they didn't get very much tallow on them either, did they?
Well, yes, they fattened fairly well, but they weren't wool growers.
What would they do with those sheep? Send them off to market, dry them in?
Ship the lambs when they had access to the railroad. And they mostly went to Los Angeles and Kansas City markets.
I guess you don't remember what they got for lambs in those days, eh?
No, I don't.
Nor for the wool?
No, I don't remember.
Well, they started in the vicinity you just talked about, and then they spread on out. And isn't it when they started to go into new territory that they went into Pleasant Valley?
Well, they wanted to use Pleasant Valley for a winter range. And they met up with the Tewksbury boys, and they employed them to take these sheep in that Pleasant Valley country and winter them. And they undertook to take that range away from the Graham boys, who were cattlemen.
You think the Grahams were in there with prior rights?
Undoubtedly.
And then the Tewksburys came in.
And they were misinformed in regard to the status of the Graham boys' rights. And they were led to believe that they were being deprived of their rights. And I think the Tewksburys are more or less honorable to start with, but they're badly misinformed, become agitated or exercised over being robbed out of what they well, at least they thought they were being robbed out of a personal right. And just one bad act after another led up to the Tonto Basin War.
Well, what did they do? Send a couple thousand head of sheep in, a band or two, was it, to begin with?
About 3-4 bands, I think.
And then, I guess you ran bands like they did nowadays, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 head in the band, huh?
Yes.
And then, as I understand, the Grahams shot one of the sheep herders that was working for the Tewksburys. Is that the way it started?
Well, I don't know just what the overtact was, but I think that they cut some dags of sheep at one Graham boy's water hole, and there seems to be some question as to who fired the first shot, the sheepmen or the cowmen.
Joe, did you have a thought? Joe Pearce had a thought on that.
While the Graham boys felt that their range was being intruded upon and their rights, there was an Indian herder. They claimed he was an Indian, not a Mexican, but an Indian herder, was found dead right at the campground and right where the sheep were bedded. And the Tewksbury's were very much angered over that, and they laid it to the Graham brothers, while they never did have any direct evidence in this case. But that's the first shot that was fired in the Pleasant Valley War.
Joe, did you know the Grahams or the Tewksburys, any of them personally?
I was personally acquainted with the Graham brothers, and I knew Ed and George Tewksbury. We had a ranch right close to the Pleasant Valley at what is now Heber, and it is on the old Pierce Wash, just a few miles east of Heber. And the Tewksburys and the Graham boys used to come and stop with us frequently. And I was well acquainted with Andy Cooper, who was leading the gang that fought the Tewksburys so hard the day that the Tewksbury wives were in the home where the Tewksbury boys were killed. And Andy Cooper, 2 days later, rode into Holbrook with his gang of 5 Confederates and boasted that he'd just done away with the gang of the Tewksburys, and he was in sympathy with the Graham faction. And it was charged that Commodore Owens, who was sheriff of the county at that time, was a little afraid to bother with Andy Cooper and his gang, especially Andy, because his name was what was his name? His right name wasn't Cooper. Blevins. Andy Blevins was his right name. He was a tall, fine-looking fellow, dark complexion, and we used to talk to Andy and was well acquainted with Andy and Hamp Blevins and all the Blevins boys, in fact. He'd stop with us frequently. Well, the word reached Commodore Owens that he was afraid to arrest Andy. And one day, these 5 men rode about 2 days after the killing, the fight they'd had with in Pleasant Valley with the Tewksburys. And Commodore said, well, I'll show you what I can do. So he went down to a little house in Holbrook near the railroad track, and he walked up in the front of the building, and he asked Andy, he says, Andy, I have a warrant for you. Well, Andy asked him, he says, what is it, Commodore? Well, he says, it's the same old case of horse stealing. And Commodore said, well, he says, are you ready to go with me? And he said, wait just a moment and I'll let you know. And he turned around and he gave a motion with his hand like that for the others to get ready inside. Andy was in the door and Commodore was standing outside in front there with a little .44 Winchester in his hands. And just then Commodore says, are you ready to go with me? And he said no. Andy said no. And at the same time he reached for his gun and Commodore shot him right through the middle. He fell right on the floor. Then the others began to scramble around in the house, and he shot 4 of them and then wounded John Blevins. John lived and served a little term for resisting the law at the time. This was done on my birthday on September the 4th, 1877.
Did they take some shots at Commodore Owens? They must have.
Yeah, they took several shots at Commodore, and the Commodore's horse was hooked out. I've seen the place just shortly afterwards where the fighting took place, and Commodore's horse was right out in front of the house, and it had 3 bullet holes plumb through the horse. where he'd killed his horse, and the bridle was hooked over the gate, and the horse's head was held up from the ground at the time. I've sat and combed Commodore Owen's hair many times, and he used to come to my father's home and was very friendly, and I was very well acquainted with him. And I asked this Commodore, he was one of the famous gunmen of the West, and I said, Commodore, I'd like to know how many men you've killed. Well, he says, Joe, he says, that's a kind of a secret of mine, and I think you're a little bit personal, but he says, go ahead and comb my hair, but be damn sure that you don't pull any hair out of my head, he says, because I'll be just like old Samson, he says, when the women combed his hair, and he got his hair in the loom, he says, whenever he lost his hair, he had no more strength, he says, and I know you don't want to put me down as a weakling.
Where did he get the name Commodore?
Well, his name was he was named after Commodore P. Owens, a great Commodore Owens, a naval officer.
He was related to him?
He was related directly to him, he told me.
I understand he was very a striking character. He had long hair, it came down on his shoulders, sort of like Buffalo Bill.
Yeah, way down. I've combed his hair many times. He come way down over his, down to his hips. And when he had a horse ranch over below St. John's, what they call Commodore now. It was near Navajo, and the Indians, he had a lot of blooded stallions, and the Indians stole 2 of his stallions one night and got off some of his blooded horses, and Commodore would undo his hair. He'd let it undo it all and comb it loose, and then he'd run after the Indian. His hair would stick way back behind, and it would scare the Indians to death, and they called him the Chindi. You know what that is, Rube?
Devil. It's the devil, isn't it?
That's what they called him, and they said the bullets wouldn't bend to him. They'd shot at him, but the bullet wouldn't go through his hide. It was Chindi.
Was his hair white?
Light red, just a brown, light brown.
Was he a pugnacious sort of a fella, or did he just go along and these things would come to him and he'd take care of the situations as they arose?
Well, it matters not. Let me tell you that I'm glad you asked me that, Mr. Babbitt.
Call me George, Joe, my gosh.
All right, George. I thought maybe you'd want this of record.
No, that's all right. That's good,
That's
too.
been a pleasure. I've been in the cow camp. I knew Commodore Owens very well. And I've been in the cow camp around Springerville and Holbrook and Dry Lake when the Hash Knife boys were there and when there were tough men in camp and many men charged with crime. And I've heard them talk around the campfire and say, well, if that long-haired SB comes around here, he's nothing but a damn tenderfoot. He says he wouldn't be a tenderfoot if he didn't wear 6 shooters with a handle sticking out in front. We'll teach him a damn good lesson if he comes around giving us any baking powders. And just as soon as I noticed that he hit the cow camp, the fellows had been talking the loudest and the most. Oh, Mr. Owens, come in. He said, here's a plate. Come on, I'll pour you a little coffee, Mr. Owens. And get up here to the table, Mr. Owens. And they were polished gentlemen in the case of Commodore Owens.
How old was he about that time?
Commodore Owens then was about, 40.
Do you know anything about where he came from or how he happened to arrive in Holbrook?
Yes, sir. He was born in 1867. And he came to Holbrook and made his home in and around St. John's first, before the counties were divided, Navajo and Apache County. He lived in what was then Yavapai County, like I did when my people first came to Arizona. It was Yavapai County. Coconino, Apache was all Yavapai County. And when the counties were divided, Navajo and Apache, why the Commodore came in sheriff of the county. Very good. Now, what was it you asked me?
He was a good law enforcement officer.
Yeah, he died on the 10th day of in Seligman, on the 10th day of December, 1800 and 1900. On the 10th day of December 1900 and
it was long in the early early 1900s somewhere, was it?
Yeah, 27.
Uh-huh. Well, he died from natural causes?
Yes.
Did he ever get shot that you know of? Did he have any holes through him? In spite of what the Indians thought about him?
No, I don't think he was ever shot.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd stop at our ranch, and he was the one man that had been to the Pleasant Valley, and while the courts were in session and the troubles on, and they were trying to stop this terrible Pleasant Valley war, and he'd go right in there lone-handed into Pleasant Valley and wouldn't take even a deputy with him. And he would bring men out of there 2, 3, and 4 at a time as witnesses, and some was charged with crime to bring them to St. John's for trial in Holbrook. And the day this killing came on, at Holbrook, when he met this Blevins gang, they call them, why, some of the men there said to him, Sheriff Frank Justice of Peace Frank Wharton at Holbrook says, Commodore, says, you better get some help. You got a hard bunch to face down there. And Wharton says, I'll swear in 2 or 3 deputies to help you. Arrest that gang, because they're a hard gang, and you know they are. He says, oh, hell no. He says, somebody might get hurt. And I'll do that alone.
What did he do, carry 45s on him? Was the handle sticking frontward?
He was a 2-gun man. I've seen him many times, and I've handled his guns. He wore his 6-shooters on one belt, and with the stocks extending forward. The handle of the gun was sticking forward instead of sticking back. That's the way he wore his guns.
You'd have to yank him and pull him out around that way.
He said, I can draw a gun quicker this way than I can this way. He'd show me.
Cross over then, huh?
Yeah, cross over.
You'd have to cross over in front of him.
Yeah, cross over. That's the way. And he would hand it with either hand. He'd show me. When he come to our home, there's a little desert country back of our home. He says, Joe, I want you to learn to handle a gun, so you may have to use it sometime. But he says, I'm going to pray for you that you never will. And he'd get his gun this way, and then he'd take his other hand and swing around and shoot right or left-handed. Oh, he was like lightning. Like lightning.
What kind of guns did he use? Colt 45?
He Colt 45, long barrel.
The old Frontier model.
Just like Frank and Jesse James, the same gun. I've seen the picture of them. Now, I was in Reno, Nevada about 2 weeks ago, and I saw the guns there, the same kind that Commodore Owens used and that Wild Bill Hickok used, with Wild Bill Hickok's name carved in the handle of the 45s, and a gun that Wyatt Earp's supposed to be used, a Tombstone, and the guns that Franks and Jesse James used with their names carved in the handle. They told me in Reno, Nevada, 2 weeks ago.
That's probably up to Harold's Club, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, they've got a lot of guns there, I know. I don't tap that place. I think it might. Why, you know, you were talking about Commodore Owens' long hair. It went down to his waist. How would he take care of it ordinarily? Would he tie it up on his head? He didn't always have it streaming behind him, did he?
No. He wouldn't. Well, I have seen him wrap it and tie it, but he tied it with a string like the women do, right around close to the back of his head. He wrapped that 3 or 4 times with a wide ribbon, about an inch wide ribbon. He wrapped that right around his head and pulled it tight as he could, then took another little string lower down and wrapped it again to hold it together. But when he wanted to scare the Indians and make him think he was a chindi, he untied his hair and it stuck way back behind this way.
Well, was he unusual in any other way than wearing the long hair? Was he unusual in any other way? I mean, peculiar, would you say? This long hair would be a little unusual, I think, for a...
Well, he was I'll say this for him. He was the most cool and composed man I ever met, and nothing would excite him. And I'd like to tell one little incident that showed why he was put in sheriff of the county, if it'd be an order.
Sure, go ahead, yeah.
After the fight of the cowboys with the Mexicans at St. John's on San Juan's Day, on the 25th day of June, the Mexicans killed a man by the name of Greer, and they shot up, killed a few other men there, and they put a few men in jail. And they put some of the Greer boys in jail, Nat Greer and Dick Greer. They had them in jail at St. John's, and he was very well acquainted with the Greer boys, Commodore was. And the Mexicans had these boys locked up and had kept them there about 2 days after the fight. And Commodore heard about it, and he went lone-handed, put on his 2 6-shooters and walked right down to the jail at St. John's and asked the jailer to let him in. He says, I'd like to go in and talk to the boys. Sure, come on in. And he walked in, he said to Dick Greer, Nat Greer, he says, what are you doing in here, boys? I don't know, we're in here, and this Joe Woods at Holbrook used to be the sheriff. Joe was in there at the time, and the nigger by the name of Jeff was in that jail at the time. He said, what are you doing in here, boys? Well, I don't know, we're in here, but he just pulled out his 2 6-shooters and covered the jailer and 2 other Mexicans behind. He says, well, you get out of here. You don't belong here, just walk out. And in 30 days, I had him nominated for sheriff of Apache County.
Pays to advertise.
Why, did Owens have any Indian blood in him?
No. No, he was born in Tennessee.
Southerner?
Yeah, Southerner.
Pardon me? Well, I don't know. Why did he have that long hair? Why didn't he cut it off?
But it seemed like he said that he felt better, his health was better with long hair, and he enjoyed it. He said, when I was out lonely, he said, I spent a many half hour combing my hair and relieving my brain.
He thought he was connected with Samson some way, I guess.
Yes, he said he was. He said, don't you never pull a hair out of my head, he said.
Uh-huh.
And I'd comb his hair.
Well, Joe, pardon me, to come back to the Grahams and the Tewksburys. Now, what were the names of the Graham boys and also the Tewksburys? Do you remember the names of the boys?
Well, Ed and George Tewksbury, I know them.
There were just 2 of the Tewksburys?
That's the only 2 at Cranebury. And
were there any other in the Tewksbury family?
Well, the old man was there.
Uh-huh.
The old man Tewksbury, his name was, can you remember his name? I used to know his name, but I knew Ed and George Tewksbury.
Well, they were just ranchers around.
Just ranchers, just ranchers. And I'll tell you, George, there's always been a little question. You see, about when Jim Stinson sold out his place, his ranch in Snowflake, Flakes give him about 700 or 800 head of cattle, 500, I think, 500 head of cows for his claim in Snowflake. He moved his cattle over into Pleasant Valley, and he let the Graham boys run his cattle. And they didn't belong to the Graham boys, but he was running Jim Stinson's cattle, the Grahams were. And they said then, the Tewksburys, why, you fellas are you, now this is an important and vital thing that I'm going to say about... I'm going to say one thing that's a vital thing about the Pleasant Valley War, and that's this, George, and I'd like to have it remembered well. The Tewksburys told the Graham boys, it says, now here, you're running cattle on shares for Grahams. We have just as much to rent sheep and run on shares on this range as you have to run cattle for Grahams, for Jim Stinson. That's what they told him. It was tit for tat.
In other words, that was an open range, and anybody had a right to it,
yeah.
Is that it?
That was open range.
And the fact that you were there first didn't give you a complete right to the range, is that it?
No, not exactly. And they thought it was quite a big range, you know.
Excuse me just a minute.
Yeah.
Excuse the interruption, Joe, but to come back to the Tewksburys,
yes,
they were just normal, law-abiding citizens in the cattle ranges in the early days. Is that it?
Yes. And
what sort of looking fellows were they? Big men, little men?
Well, they were pretty good-sized men, straight, very erect. They were a half-bred Indian. What stock were they, Rube?
Umatilla.
Umatilla?
Yeah.
Umatilla Indians?
From Oregon.
Uh-huh.
Weren't they?
Yeah.
Well, they weren't troublemakers then?
No, sir, very peaceful men.
Now, the Grahams, how about those boys?
Well, the Graham boys seemed to be very peaceable men. They'd come to our home, and I remember the Graham boys, the first coat or vest that I ever saw that was made of the color of cattle, They had spotted cattle, black and white, spots on them, and they had left the hair. They'd make the coat. They'd made them by hand, and they had the spotted vest and the spotted coat, and the skin was still the hair was still on the skin, and the stripes on their arms, the stripes. That's what the Graham boys used to use.
Well, those the cattle. Did they make the coats from the cattle they ran in the
cattle they ran? Yes.
They were sort of a mixed breed, sort of Mexican stock cattle?
Yeah, they had Mexican stock someplace.
Mm-hmm. Did they have a pretty big outfit?
Well, they had about 1,000 head of cattle.
Pretty good operation. What was their brand, do you remember?
Oh, their brand was the F.
F, uh-huh.
Flake. They bought them a flake, and they kept the same brand in there.
What did you say? The stock was all mixed up like Mexican cattle, different colors, black and white?
They had that red stock. The Flake's cattle were a pretty good brand of cattle, but they found they got this spotted mixed cattle in that country there. I don't know where they got it, but Flake's cattle were a pretty good brand of cattle, pretty good stock of cattle. But that's the kind of the skin they'd gotten a hold of to make the coats and vests.
Well, now you sort of feel that both the Tewksbury's and the Grahams were pretty decent fellows, both factions, but they got started on this war, and it sort of grew on them and got worse and worse. Is that it?
It got worse and worse, that's right.
Now, I've heard stories about some of the boys getting shot, and the folks in the house, was it the Tewksbury's in the house, couldn't get out, and the hogs came up and ate the bodies. Is there anything to that?
Oh, yes, that's true.
What was that circumstance?
Well, this Andy Blevins, Andy Cooper, they called him. His name was Andy Blevins, and the 5 of his Confederates, they surrounded the Tewksbury home. I've been to the old Tewksbury home, and I guess Rube has many a time. I've been there. George Hubbard was my brother-in-law who lived just a little ways away from there, married my sister. And I used to visit there, and George told me the story well. And it was like this. They surrounded the house, and they opened fire on the house, and they held, just like it was firing into a fort for a day and night steady. They fired probably 1,000 shots into that home. And they killed 2 of the Tewksbury boys. And they left them about 400 yards from the house. And
they must have sneaked up on the Tewksbury boys when they were out of the house.
When they was out of the house. And there's others in the house, too.
Yeah, I see.
There's a couple more in the house. But they killed these 2 boys outside.
Before they could get over to the protection of the house.
Before they could get back to the house. And they left them laying right there in the hot sun. And the women's folks saw their husband shot down out there. And they stood it just as long as they could. And they said, well... And the fire ceased. The Blevins gang, they ceased fire a little while, and these 2 Tewksbury women picked up the shovel and says, if they kill us, they can kill away the hogs. There are a lot of wild hogs there running in the country. These javelinas and wild hogs, too. But these were javelinas, from what I understand. And they went in there and went to rooting the bodies, and they began to tearing the clothes off, and they could see them tear off the clothes off of the boys, and getting at the meat of the boys. And then they began to tear the flesh of the boys, and they said they can kill us if they want to. They went right out there and took their shovels, and each of them they dug a hole for their husband, the other dug a hole for their husband, and they buried them up, and they run the hogs away.
Well, the Blevins, of course, were representing the Grahams.
They were representing the Grahams.
Mm-hmm.
The Graham boys, they said George Graham, I thought, was there. Javelinas and wild hogs, too. But these were javelinas, from what I understand. And they went in there and went to rooting the bodies, and they began to tearing the clothes off, and they could see them tear off the clothes off of the boys, and getting at the meat of the boys. And then they began to tear the flesh of the boys, and they said they can kill us if they want to. They went right out there and took their shovels, and each of them they dug a hole for their husband, the other dug a hole for their husband, and they buried them up, and they run the hogs away.
Well, the Blevins, of course, were representing the Grahams.
They were representing the Grahams.
Mm-hmm.
The Graham boys, they said George Graham, I thought, was there with them.
And how many of the Graham boys were there?
Let's see. George was the last one to get killed. I think there's 4 of them.
You don't remember the names?
I can't call it right now.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Who do you feel won that war? Or was it a draw?
It's just as near a draw as could ever be made. There's just as many killed on the Graham side, and the Tewksbury's proved they had a powerful faction behind them. There were a power, and the Grahams had too. They're just about evenly divided. Now the question has been asked me many times. George, I'll tell you, I knew many of them. I knew Charlie Deshay, and I knew old man Loper. I need the name in a minute. Well, I knew the Neglin boys, and I knew old man Gruel, and I know old Jake Lofer, Lauffer, Jake Lofer. And Jake was, there was certain sympathy on each side, and they're just about even divided. And I asked Jake Lofer one time, I'd like to make this a matter of record to George. I was helping bring a trail, a big herd of cattle in from northern Arizona, from Holbrook to Tempe for Will C. Barnes. And that was just at the close of the Pleasant Valley War. And when we got to Pleasant Valley, Jake Lofer and the Neglin boys and a few more rode up to our camp to look at our cattle. And Barnes asked him, he says, Jake, Barnes knew Jake. He said, Jake had got shot in the legs and he was badly hurt. He owned about 400 or 500 head of cattle. Jake didn't. He was in sympathy with the Graham boys. He says, I'd like to know about how many men were really lost in this Pleasant Valley Tornado Basin War. And he says, right on without stopping, he says, Jake, he says, I see you wear your six-shooter and your long tom here. What's the matter? He says, I thought the war was over. Oh, it is, he says, but he says, why do you wear your guns? Well, he says, I'll tell you, Bill, call him Bill Barnes. I'll tell you, Bill, he says, I wear my guns because I have some neighbors down here that are slow to forget.
Part of the Tewksbury bunch, huh? What do you mean by long tom? You mean his pistol?
A long tom rifle. He had a rifle. It was an old...
Killed in the Tewksbury Grand Feud.
Yes. Well, Jake Lofer was badly wounded. His leg was shot and he couldn't hardly get around. He could just walk a little bit. And he says, I carry lead now from the effects of this damn war, he says, and I don't feel any too good about it. And he says, I've got some neighbors down here that's slow to forget. He says, that's the reason I carry my artillery now. All right, and Will Barnes says, well, Jake, he said, how many men do you think that actually lost their lives during this war? Well, Jake says, I've kept pretty good track, he says, and I know men coming in here that never went out, and I know men that lived here that never went out, and he said, I'm safe in saying there's about 35 men lost their lives.
Now, how long did that war go on?
Well, it went on from about, it started in about 1886.
Let's see. Then old Vernon was sheriff.
Yeah, John,
Yavapai County.
Yeah, he was sheriff.
He's the one that made several trips in there to try to effect an arrest.
Yeah, he was
break
sheriff.
up the war.
He was a man that pretty near broke Yavapai County going in there on campaigns so much he made 2 or 3 trips through that village country to quell that terrible insurrection, we might call it. And he put in his claims to the Yavapai County. They couldn't get a meal ticket. Not a man served in the county offices. Over it, they were completely broke.
Well, did the sheep keep on running, or did they, as a result of the war?
No.
They ran the sheep out of the Pleasant Valley.
No, the Daggs brothers pulled out. But I would like to say a little more about the Daggs, George.
Okay.
My father brought in the first bunch of sheep, of blooded Cotswool sheep, into the territory of Arizona, and he crossed them at the Pierce Ferry and crossed over where Kingman is now and brought them in, and we run sheep. I knew the Daggs brothers before.
When was it your dad brought sheep in?
My daddy brought sheep in here in 1880.
1880. And then your father met the Daggs brothers.
Then the Daggs brothers lived at what's known as Daggs Ranch up there just about 10 mile above Taylor Road. And they owned the Daggs Ranch, and they owned a ranch over near Shola where Scots live now. The Daggs owned that first. And that's where I knew Avril Daggs and the Daggs brothers. It's Rube mentioned. I know you're exact on the names. And Father run sheep with them. They were very near neighbors there together. And then they moved out, and the Scott brothers came in there and took up the range, and the Daggs moved out to Flagstaff and took the herds from there. And from Flagstaff is where Rube tells they're going wintering over in their country. That's very accurate.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also knew the Daggs brothers personally.
Oh, I knew the Daggs brothers personally.
They apparently made a lot of money in their stock operations.
They did. Yes, they were very successful.
What type of men would you classify them as being?
Well, sure, they were very intelligent. They were well-educated men, and I think they were from Missouri.
That's right.
They told me they were from Missouri, and I have never forgotten it. And they were very intelligent men and seemed to be very agreeable men, and they were financially they were doing very well. But they came down to Tempe, and they opened up a little bank down there at Tempe, and it seemed like this Graham faction had a good deal of influence with them, and the Daggs brothers went belly up in the banking business at Tempe. They found out that the cattlemen had influence, and they deserted them, and they lost their $100,000 in Tempe in their bank venture.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, thanks, Joe. Now, Rube had an idea about the Daggs brothers here. You feel that they sort of precipitated that war. Is that it, Rube?
Why, unquestionably. They wanted that range. And they had natural talent for causing disturbance, range disturbance particularly. And they got these...
their advantage? Was that the idea? Their talents would always work to their advantage.
Yes. Oh, yes. All the time. And they first started to take a range away from a man by the name of Saunders, B.F. Saunders, who in later years moved into the strip north of the Grand Canyon in what is known as the Kaibab Forest. And then from there to Salt Lake, and engaged in the livestock commission business with a man by the name of Haley. But at the time I recall him first, he was in near Soldier and Hay Lake. He had some Texas cattle and living there, and Daggs brothers went over and gave him notice to leave. And he was a small man, spare-built, mild-spoken old gentleman, you know. He was a perfect gentleman. And they went over and told him, well, he says, isn't that a kind of an unusual request? And Daggs told him, well, they meant what they said. Well, they were digging a pit. They were going to make a dip there for some purpose or other. And there was a man by the name of Scribner, a man by the name of Weimer, and a man we called Indian Joe, and 2 or 3 cowpunchers working for Saunders. Well, they had the Daggs brothers surrounded before they realized where they were. And they made Frank and Avril Daggs get down and throw a few shovels of dirt out of this pit. And Daggs wanted to know what the purpose was. Well, he says, we're fixing the place to put you if you come back. And so they took the burros and the horses and turned them over to Mexicans and put a guard over them and told them to take them off from their range. And they took the Daggs brothers, and the cowboys were going to take their shoes away from them and they herded these sheep off from his range barefooted, and he wouldn't let them do that. He just told him, he said, now you get behind these sheep and you herd them a while and take them off. He says, I don't believe in persecuting people that's working for wages. He says, if I start any trouble at all, he says, I'm going to start the head and work down. Just told him, he said, now you get behind these sheep and you herd them a while and take them off. He says, I don't believe in persecuting people that's working for wages. He says, if I start any trouble at all, he says, I'm going to start the head and work down. He says, I'm going to work up. Well, they moved him off his range, and then they were quite peaceable for a time. And they found these Tewksbury boys, and they were, without a doubt, they were good boys. Had no intention of bothering anybody, weren't greedy or anything. They were just offered an unusual salary. I don't believe they realized what that was for. I don't believe that they, at the time, realized that they were being led into their own destruction. But however, they went into Pleasant Valley with Dagg's sheep. And Dagg's, true to their way of doing business, they stayed in the background and hollered sick 'em to these boys, you know, and they got into trouble with the Graham boys. Now that's as near as I could get. I talked to Jim Roberts quite a number of times, and he wasn't the biggest part of that war. And that was his opinion of the matter. I talked to a man with the name of Chris Jerkinson that worked on the out edge of that. He was what they termed Dagg's brother's destroying angel. He's the one that sent the lightning bolts to kill the sheep herders after Dagg's got in their debt. And he was told me afterwards he became very bitter towards Dagg's brothers. And he told me that there wasn't any question in the world but what they just picked that fight with the Tewksbury brothers.
They figured they didn't have anything to lose and might gain a lot.
Yes. And in later years, I've become well acquainted with two half-brothers of the Tewksbury boys. There was Guff Shoulder and Tom Shoulders. And Tewksbury's boy's mother, she remarried, and these Shoulder boys were raised in the basin and in close to Prescott, out in the mountains from Prescott. And they told me without any doubt in the world that their brothers had no intention of engrossing on anybody.
They were just pawns in the games that the Dagg's boys were playing, trying to enlarge their range.
That was right.
Well, did they really need that range for their operation?
No, they didn't. They just had a notion that they wanted to go somewhere, why, their idea was go. And just a little contentious. Now, they jumped on to Hugh Campbell and Dan Francis. You know, they were just starting. And Jack Daggs, there's an old gentleman by the name of Gourmet Bray who run a store in Flagstaff. It's there where the drugstore is on the corner of LaRue Street on, I think it's LaRue, Flagstaff.
Santa Fe, I think.
Yes, Santa Fe.
An old building there, yeah.
Yeah, it's an old building where Gourmet Bray run their little store. Why, Hugh Campbell was in there for some purpose or other, and Dagg's brothers came in. And they jumped on to Hugh. There was three of them. And then that is, they began to tongue lash him. And Hugh stood there and looked at him, and I was standing back a ways, of course, listening. And all at once, Hugh, he straightened out his arm. Jack Daggs fell about halfway across the building. Got up with one eye swollen shut. You stood around there, and for the Daggs brothers hummed around like a nest of hornets for about 10 minutes, and you stood there and never uttered a word. Just stood there and looked, kind of backed up towards the counter so couldn't anybody get behind him, and stood there and looked at him. Answered them, finally turned around and walked away.
In other words, the Daggs boys were sort of physical cowards unless they had the odds.
All the time. Now they moved away in a later day and went north of Williams in what was known as no man's land in there. There's a strip of land between the Tuchian and the Grand Canyon Forest, you know. That and they called that no man's land. You didn't need any permit or anything to go in on it because it required a permit to get on Forest Reserve land. And Daggs couldn't get a permit to run sheep on forest land because other people had prior rights over them. So they run on this neutral strip. And I was a forest ranger at the time, and I had trouble with them continuously. They'd come up and come in on the Forest Reserve, and then they would deny it. Only sheep in the country, you know, and they'd come in 3 or 4 miles, slip in 3 or 4 miles on the Forest Reserve, and you'd go and trail them right off and find the sheep probably in a couple hundred yards of the Forest Service line, and then they'd still get up. They had 2 boys, and they taught those boys why the truth didn't mean any more to them than it would a catfish. They'd tell any kind of a story, you know, that come in their mind. And Frank would, that was one of the older boys, he was the father of this George Daggs. Well, later the war come on, and George Daggs, George left the country. They signed him for drafts, you know, and he got up and left. He was back here once, and they just missed getting him by about a door's width. But he got out again, and just where he is, I don't know. Some people say he's in Mexico, and others say he went to Argentina. But anyhow, he didn't go to war.
That's the last of the Daggs, huh?
That was the last of the Daggs brothers.
They weren't too well liked or thought of, apparently, in the...
At no place. Sure. Anywhere they went, they were considered the people that was invariably looking for the best of it. Now, the bank, they started in Mesa. There's a young lady had taught school for a number of years. She accumulated about $2,000 in savings. She put it in that bank one evening, and the next morning the bank was marked closed. Her brother went and got a double-barrel shotgun, went down and punched the glass out of the window, and Daggs run to see what was the matter, and he put this shotgun down on him and had one of the brothers go and bring him out $2,000. He took it and gave it to his sister. And that was one run on a bank that won. He got his money. And the people that told me about that was Frank and Harv Beasley. They were both witnesses to the act.
Uh-huh.
They lived in Flagstaff, you know, for a good many years. You knew Al Beasley.
Oh, yes, Al. I knew Al.
Well, there's Frank and Harv were brothers of Al.
Uh-huh. Al was quite a storyteller.
Yes, Al was quite a character.
Well, now in this Graham Tewksbury Pleasant Valley War, do you think of any other phases of it or any comments you might like to make?
Well, it was Jim Roberts. He was a noted peace officer throughout the state of Arizona. He spent part of his time in Jerome, and he had a horse stolen from him, and he thought that the Tewksburys had something to do with that, And he took sides with the Graham boys in that war, and he was in it about almost half the time that it was going on.
Was he one of the rangers later on, or was he a ranger?
No, he was a deputy sheriff, General. You remember they had a bank robbery over there once, and you remember a man shooting and killing one bank robber and capturing another one, and they never got the money back. And
no, what was that, Holbrook?
No, that was over at Jerome.
Oh, Jerome.
Yes. Well, he was the one. He was an old man then, and he was the one that put up that fight there. And see, when those boys come out of the bank in the car, he shot through the fender and busted the tire. And the car creamed and run off from a wall. You know how Jerome's built. Run off from one of those walls. And that fella got up and run, and Jim was busy with this other fella. And the other boy pulled a gun on Jim, and that was a dangerous thing to do. Jim left him laying right where he pulled the gun.
Well, did some of the hash knife cowboys mix up in this?
Oh, they were. A few of them went back and forward in there. There was Jim Saunders and another fellow that. They called him. Let me see what his name was. His name was. Huh?
I knew all of them.
Gallagher and Jim Saunders was two men that used to go in there. They went in there just more for excitement, you know. They wanted to get into something, and that was a good place.
They didn't represent the hash knife as an outfit. They just were individuals who were looking for fun,
just looking for some side to take. Naturally, they being from Texas, they leaned towards the cowman.
Yeah.
Now, there was one peculiar thing about that fight. People that kept out of it were neutral, strictly neutral. Neither a Graham or a Tewksbury ever violated their neutrality. If a Tewksbury was seen going into your house and receiving any assistance or anything, they marked you as a sympathizer, or vice versa with a Graham. But you just said, I'm neutral, and kept away from them. They religiously respected your neutrality. Now, we lived fairly close to that war. There's lots of those fellows mixed in that, come up close to where we lived. They would...
Where did you live, Rube?
Stoneman Lake.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. That was the drum thing.
Yes. Now, they wouldn't come down in there and ask a favor. No matter how badly they needed it, they just wouldn't come because they didn't want to drag anybody. That showed the principle that they was in both crews, those men. They weren't asking anybody to do any fighting for them, or they weren't trying to drag you into any controversy. If you got in it, you got in it of your own volition, not for them.
Well, they'd all fought like the Dags, like the Grahams and the Tewksburys had been a lot cleaner war, I guess.
Yes, it would, but there was a lot of bushwhacking, and that was done mostly by such people as the Bevins. Now, I never thought they were a very good bunch. I don't know what. So probably a mean thing to say, but I believe Commodore Owens done a fairly good job when he got rid of most of them because they didn't add any to the peace and quietude of the community or the safety of your property in any way by being there. So,
well, they were like a counterpart of the modern day gangster to a certain extent, that group that you're talking about. If they're looking for trouble and two gunmen.
Well, they just came in there, and that was an occupation. There was a time in the West when gun toters is an occupation in itself. You wouldn't gain that idea through moving pictures and so forth, but you gained it by experience, you know.
They got paid to teach an order, is that it?
That was it.
They weren't necessarily killers.
Range wars, why they'd go in, and if you needed a lot of men, had plenty of money, well, you could change their sympathy. All right, they this is money, and they said, well, he's working for the man, we'll help him protect his property. That was their excuse.
Did it take much money to hire one of those young men?
Oh, no, just a couple meals a day, and if you was off spending $30, $40 a month, we'd get a fairly good gunman.
Big outfits got a lot of homesteads that way.
Yes. Yes, they come.
Wiped out the settlers.
Yeah, they were wiped them out. The little old men.
No.
I knew the Hash Knife boys was at the wagon the time they went to Pleasant Valley to get into that trouble.
Who were some of those boys, Joe?
I can tell you the names of them, but they left I don't want to interrupt you.
No, that's all right, Joe. We're just tossing us back and forth. We're going to get to Jack in a few minutes, too, about southern Arizona.
This is Joe Pearce speaking again, and I'm telling a little bit about the Hash Knife boys who left the Hash Knife wagon at Dry Lake in the summer of 1887 to go to Pleasant Valley. They were in sympathy with the Graham brothers. They went, they armed themselves well, and the man who organized them was a gunman who came in here employed by the Hash Knife. He was a professional gunman, John Payne, and he had been hired by the Hash Knife to keep sheep off the Hash Knife range and to keep down cattle rustling. And they had 2 or 3 real gunmen, but Payne was the man who led this first party into Pleasant Valley. Will C. Barnes had a chuck wagon at Dry Lake, and he had a young fellow working for him named Billy St. George, Billy Richards. And I'm too close.
No, a little bit, yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it'll be.
And Payne said, well, he says, he come there one night from Pinedale, and he said, well, boys, he says, old man Blevins has turned up missing, and he was going down there under the pretext of hunting the old man Blevins. That's what he started in with. And Barnes told him, he says, the Payne, he says, you know that what you're going down there for to mix up in that Pleasant Valley War. And he says, I want you boys to keep out. You Hash Knife boys. He says, they're Grahams, they're peaceable men, and he says, they're fighters from hell. And those Tewksburys, he says, they'll fight, and you'll get more fight than you want. Those Tewksbury men are not going to, if you get in there on their range, he says, you'll get more fight than you can carry off with. I heard Barnes tell these men that. Payne got Tom Tucker and Bob Gillespie, a man by the name of Blevins, and you mentioned Tom Pickett. Tom Pickett.
Who is this Jim Saunders? Did you know him? Did he settle down near Tombstone later on, or do you know? He had a son who was with the Highway Patrol. Tell me about his dad. Curly Bill and all those folks.
I'll tell you who he was. Remember Mickey Roach shooting a man with a shotgun there in Winslow and disfigured him?
Yeah.
Well, that was Jim Saunders.
That's Jim Saunders.
Yeah.
Oh, Jim Saunders, not Saunders.
Was the Hash Knife man, yeah.
Saunders, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Jim Saunders, sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there was about 9 of
You
them.
remember Mickey Roach, well?
Yes.
Well, you remember in Winslow, they had a row there in the saloon, and Mickey Roach shot a man in the face or tore off part of his chin, disfigured him.
Yes, I heard about it.
Well, that's really...
That was Saunders, I see, huh?
Yeah.
Now, who were some of the rest of these fellows? Now,
Well,
Joe, excuse the interruption.
Yeah, that's all right, George. There was... now, just a minute. And Tom Pickett, he's another gunman. And a fellow by the name, they called him Eugene Clark. But that was not his name. His name was Middleton.
Middleton, Joe Middleton.
Yeah. And there's about 9 of them that left. I saw them when they got their arms. They sat up and talked and drank coffee all night. And then Billy St. Joe went out, and this brought on a very humorous matter a little bit later. Billy St. Joe, Barnes, when they got ready to leave the next morning, they got all the arms and ammunition they could dig out of the hash knife chuck wagon and out of Barnes' wagon that they could steal out to be armed to go down there. They never took a pack horse or anything. And Barnes told him, he says, you keep out of there. You'll find more trouble than you want. Those Tewksbury's will fight. And Payne said, well, he says, we'll go down and clean up on those mutton eaters. And he says it won't be much of a job. And then he says the Pleasant Valley War will be over. And Payne told these hash knife boys, he says, then after this war's over, we can go in there and get a little bunch of cattle and go in the cattle business. Told all these men. We'll fight. And Payne said, well, he says, we'll go down and clean up on those mutton eaters. And he says it won't be much of a job. And then he says the Pleasant Valley War will be over. And Payne told these hash knife boys, he says, then after this war's over, we can go in there and get a little bunch of cattle and go in the cattle business. Told all these men. He says that's where we'll wind up. We'll wind up in Pleasant Valley in the cow business when we clean out these mutton eaters. Well, they left, and just before they left, Will C. Barnes told Billy St. Joe, his range foreman, he says, Billy, he says, you go out, he says, you know the boys. And Billy went out and said, here, boys, he says, I know those Tewksbury's over there, and he says, they're gamey fellows, and I think a lot of you, we've worked together here, and he says, you boys stay out, don't you go over there. He says, you'll get more fight than you want. Well, Payne led them off, and then, unfortunate for them, they went right up into the Middleton Ranch, Rube. Yeah. They rode right up to the Middleton Ranch. And Ed and George Tewksbury were in the loft, and there's portholes in the loft of that old building. And John Payne got down, and there's a lady there at the door, and they didn't know. These hash knife boys were unfortunate. They didn't know where anyone lived. They hadn't been over there before. And the lady came to the door, and Payne said, Madam, he says, what is the chance to get a bite to eat? Well, she says, we're not running a hotel here, and we'd rather you'd retire at once. You're in danger, gentlemen. And Ed and George Tewksbury could see the brand on the hash knife horses. And they said they're not in sympathy with us, and they're against us. They're in here to hunting a fight, and I guess we'd better give them a little. And they, the first shot, they shot Payne twice through the middle. He fell right in the door in front of that lady. Then they shot Blevins, shot him and killed him. He fell off his horse right beside the boys that hadn't dismounted yet, only Payne. Then they shot Tom Tucker through the thigh, and they shot Bob Gillespie through the rump, the seat, and tore an awful hole in him. And these two boys, hash knife boys there, the horses fell out from under them. They crawled on their hands and knees out, and it rained on them all night to save their lives. And they crawled 2 miles on their hands and knees, and they were both fly-blowed. When they got to the next ranch, they were in Sibley with them. They were just plumb full of fly-blows. And one hash knife boy, called him Wright, he never did come back. Maybe it was McNeil. I think it was McNeil. He left and never did come back. Well, that was a slaughter.
How many were killed in that fight?
There was about 3 men killed and about 2 men wounded in the fight. Now I'd like to say, George, that this gave the hash knife company, the cattle company, and the hash knife boys black names that they were not entitled to. They were called gunmen from then on. that they're made up of gunmen. This why it was so, they were so famous in the state and in the West as gunmen over the ending of war where they had no business.
Yes.
Now, I'd like to tell you a little humor now in connection with that.
All right.
A few days later, about 2 weeks later, when Tom Tucker and Bob Gillespie were able to ride, they came into the hash knife wagon near Heber. And they were tipped sideways in the saddle when they rode up, and the hash knife boys went out. They didn't know what the trouble was, and they said, "Come and help us down." They helped them down out of the saddle and led them over to camp. And Billy St. Joe, he says, Bob, to Bob Gillespie, he says, "Bob," he says, "how'd you come out down in Pleasant Valley?" Bob Gillespie unbuttoned his breeches and dropped them down, and he showed them a terrible hole that was shot through his side here. He says, "Billy," he says, "this souvenir is all I got out of it." And then, pretty quick, Bill said, "Bob," he says, "I hear that..."
Oh, got it.
I just want to
no, it's all right. Joe, we ran off that tape again. Again, pardon the interruption. You were telling something humorous about the I believe the hash knife cowboys getting shot up in the Graham Tewksbury.
Yes, George. This feller, Bob Gillespie, was a slow-talking old fellow, and he'd been shot with a soft-nosed bullet and with black powder, and had torn his just half the seat off, and he was in a bad shape. And Billy St. Joe, he was kind of a humorous fellow. He wanted to have a little fun out of poor old Bob if he was badly wounded. And Billy spoke up and he said, "Well, Bob," he said, "I hear that if the vigilantes, the vigilance committee, ever catches you up on the Tonto Rim, they're going to swing you to a pine." And Bob waited for a minute and he says, "Billy St. Joe," he says, "you can just tell them for me that if they ever swing old Bob to a pine, they'll have to move the pine down on the alkali flats of Holbrook and Winslow, for it ain't a-going back."
he had a belly full of it, didn't he, Joe? Well, you know, there's one question that isn't quite clear to me. We talk about the war, and you just told how this hash knife group came up to the Tewksbury Ranch. But generally speaking, how was the war carried on? Was it just sniping at individual cowboys or sheep herders, or were there organized battles other than the one that the Grahams and Tewksbury had where the hogs ate the men? Or how was the war carried on?
George, the way I had it put up, and I think I'm right, that there were certain factions on either side, and those factions were well known to each other. And they respected their factions, yes, and they respected their factions highly. And each faction knew who was for them or against them. And in Pleasant Valley, they knew one thing: you're either for us or against us. And with strangers coming in there, passing through the country, they must give a very good story to get through, to show that they were neutral, or they wouldn't get through the valley.
Well, did they snipe at each other? If the fellow was out on the range, was he liable to get shot by one of the other factions?
Oh, yes, there did a lot of sniping. They did a lot of sniping, killing, and they killed a lot of them that was never told, no history ever made of it.
Well, it was generally possibly little individual encounters of one or two men at odd, unplanned occasions that carried on. That's the way the war was carried on.
Yeah, that's the way to do. And there are different times where men were shot down through mistake, too, over at the Perkins Ranch.
Probably a third of the battles fought was not a matter of record.
It's not a matter of record, and the two men were just wantonly shot down from the Perkins Ranch, and they're killed, and there were men that shouldn't have been killed. The one mistake they made. The history doesn't record well.
Well, I guess you didn't take time to to go too much into a fellow's past, you have to protect yourself. Shoot first and ask questions afterwards. Is that it?
Yes, I know one boy by the name of Sanders that undertook to ride through the Pleasant Valley, and he was killed. He sniped as he went on the trail.
Had no part for either faction either.
And he had no interest in either faction. He's George Sanders. Knew him well.
He was probably done by some sympathizer. I don't believe it was done by either a Graham or a Tewksbury, because it's a little out of their method of fighting.
They were pretty square.
Yeah, they were. They were pretty much men all the way through, both of them, both sides. They were in that fight. And all the snipping and cowardly work that was done by sympathizers or somebody that had an axe to grind some way or other. There wasn't any use to ask a man why he was in that war. Lots of them couldn't have told you.
Well, whenever the Grahams and Tewksburys ran on each other, they started shooting against
each other. Yes, they...
Well, that was accidental in most cases when they did encounter each other.
They hunted each other. If they got little bows, they didn't give them a chance to get braced to. Well, if they thought they could go and strike and throw them off in balance, it was kind of like a prize fight. They was on their guard. They'd go out open and have a battle, or go in and charge a man. If Tewksburys knew that the Grahams were fortified in a certain place, they'd go there and watch for an even break or an advantage and fight a battle with them. And that happened in several instances.
Must have taken a lot of nerve to stay in that country the way things were.
Well, it did.
Yeah.
It took a lot of nerve. And, my sympathy has always been with the Grahams to just this extent. That they were just innocent of any intention. Had no idea of a range war or anything else until it just come on them out of a clear sky. Those people sent those men in there and began to kick them around. Well, they were of a disposition that they wouldn't stand much abuse.
It gets back to the fact that they were invaded.
That's
What did the Tewksburys do before they went under the dags on the sheep operation?
Well, they were just itinerants, workers, when dags picked them up. They hadn't been in the country too long.
They didn't have any ranches in Pleasant Valley at all?
No. And there's one thing where they were at a slight disadvantage. The Grahams knew that country much better than the Tewksburys did.
You don't know who backed the Tewksburys then, other than the dags started them off.
That's all. We don't know. Common sense would tell you that they got an immense amount of help. But just where it come from, I've never heard anybody say. Joe has mentioned two instances that was news to me. I never knew those two parties as sympathizers. But
John Rhodes was in sympathy with
yes.
John Rhodes was a very notorious gunman, and he was in sympathy with the Tewksburys.
Yes.
And there was another man there who was one of the most famous gunmen in the Pleasant Valley War, was Charlie Duché.
Yes.
And he was a man that wouldn't talk much, but he was one of the most famous gunmen. But he remained neutral for a while, and finally he went on the Graham side. And then he was a factor in that war with Charlie Duché.
Well, I heard a story about some eastern kid was out on the edge of the Pleasant Valley there and settled down. A group came along and took him out and hanged him with a couple of people that were visiting him. Do you know anything about that story?
Yes. I don't know the name, but I know that that happened. I know that they got a boy that was in there. He was innocent of any wrongdoing. He had no acquaintance with either side, but they came along and found him in what they considered Tewksbury territory. And he was murdered. That's all.
Well, didn't they take them out and hang him? And I understand there was somebody visiting with this fellow too. They took his guests out and hanged them along with
They was, and if I recall correctly, Jim Hawk.
I'd like to tell that.
Yeah, here, you do that.
Gunshot of our ranch.
I don't.
That was in gunshot of the Pearce Ranch, huh?
Right close to Pearce Ranch. You mean where the hanging took place with Jim Scott and Bob Wilson?
I think that's it, yeah.
Yeah, hung on the floor. I know that story, and I can tell it briefly.
All right, fine, Joe, if you will, please.
I sure can.
Want to sit down?
Here, Joe. You sit here.
That's a story I'd be happy to tell. Just hold it.
Well, I know that Earl Forrest, when he wrote that chapter on that hanging, it wasn't too definite as to the circumstances.
Well,
I don't believe.
Straight from the shoulder, I know.
All right, good.
I knew every man that was in that and it's hung. I knew them. All right, this is Joe Pearce speaking, and I'd like to tell about the hanging which occurred at the Jim Stott Ranch in Navajo County, where Jim Stott, Bob Wilson, and Jim Scott were hanged on the old Verde Road, just a few miles south of Heber. Jim Stott owned a horse ranch called the Stott Ranch, and it was a kind of a central place for cowmen and drifters going through the country to stop at their ranch, at his ranch. And he would feed most anyone who came there. And there was a man by the name of Bob Wilson and Jim Scott. Scott, now understand me, not Stott. Stott, S-T-O-T-T. Stott owned the ranch. Bob Wilson and Jim Scott were visiting at the ranch. And there's some horse stealing going on from the north side of the Tonto Rim to the Pleasant Valley. And there was a group of men organized, called themselves a sort of vigilance committee, and they took it upon themselves that they were going to make an example of someone to try to break up this string of horse stealing. So they rode up. They were led by, I don't know whether I ought to tell it, but I know the men who was leading the men who went up to the ranch, Stott Ranch, and I'll tell a little more before I get through the story. And just at daylight, this group of men, they're made up of citizens from around Holbrook, and one or two from Pleasant Valley. And they knocked at the door early, and these three men were inside, and told them to come out and wanted to take a ride. And they ate a little breakfast together and saddled up, and they headed due west toward right along the mountain on the old Verde Road to about 8-10 miles south of Heber. And here one man said, well, we're going to stage a little necktie party. And they put the rope around the boy's neck, and they threw it right over a limb that was hanging right over the Verde Road. And they hung the first one, they hung Stott first, Jim Stott. He was from Indiana. And he was there in the horse business, and his people, his father and mother, came out and got the remains afterwards, a few months afterwards. They swung him up, and then they treated each one of them alike. They put the rope on the boy's neck, threw the rope over the same limb, and they hung all three of them to the same limb and left them hanging right there. It's in hot weather in August. An old man, William Flake, who bought Jim Stinson out, he'd been down in the Salt River Valley looking for horses, stolen horses, and he passed there and he saw these men hanging to the tree. And they'd been hanging there probably about 3 days, they thought, or 4. And their faces were badly swollen beyond recognition. But still, he recognized Jim Stott. He was acquainted with Jim Stott quite well. He said, Stott is there. He went in and reported the matter to the sheriff, and the Justice of Peace, Frank Watering, was the coroner's inquest, held a coroner's inquest from Holbrook. They went up there and cut the bodies down, and they took them and buried them about half a mile from the rim, on the north side of the rim. And I've been to the place a good many times, and I'd like to tell what kind of gravestones they had. When Will C. Barnes and a group of us were trailing a herd of cattle through from the north to the south side of the rim, coming to Tempe for pasture, we saw the newly made graves by the side of the road, and we all went out and looked at them. On one side was the name Jim Stott. On the other side was Arbuckle Coffee. And on one side and the next one was Jim Scott. On the other side, Arbuckle Coffee. On each one was all 3 of them in that way.
Old Arbuckle Coffee boxes were used for headstones.
Arbuckle Brothers Coffee.
Yeah, it's a very famous old coffee.
Yeah, that was stuck for their headstones.
I'd like to get one of those. I'd like to get one of those Arbuckle Coffee boxes today. You can't find them for love or money. Well, anyway, now, do you feel that there was justification for this hanging? Did they have any evidence on these poor guys that they hanged?
I'll tell you.
The contrary.
Pardon me just a second, please.
I want to answer that.
Excuse the interruption again, Joe. We were talking about the culpability or the blame of these men that were hanged by that vigilante group from Holbrook. What do you think about it?
Mr. George, I'm glad to answer that question. I was well acquainted with Jim Stott, who owned the ranch, and I met his father and mother when they came back a few years, or the next year after he was killed, to take the remains back to Indiana. And I was asked that question many times, if Jim Stott had done anything out of the way. If I knew where he'd been. He lived a near neighbor to us, very near neighbor. We lived on Pierce Wash, just a few miles west of Stott Ranch. That was about 12 miles east of Heber. And I told him no. And others never found anything against Jim Stott that was out of the way in the least. He fed a few of those parties and didn't know who they were as they went through the country. Then I was asked about these 2 boys, Bob Wilson. I knew Bob Wilson around Holbrook, and he's quite a well-known character there, a young man. He came in about the time the Harrison outfit came in, and he was a very quiet, civil fellow. And Jim Scott was also hanged. There's nothing ever known against Jim Scott. They had no mark against his character at all. And I consider that one of the most foul deeds. It's a blot on that part of Arizona and a blot on the state of Arizona.
You think there was personal antagonism on the part of some of the vigilantes if they did this?
No, sir. That was just done for an example. Just the dog tray was found in bad company. That was all. They claimed that these boys were just found there at this ranch, and it was right on the line where people went to and fro to Pleasant Valley and back, and they caught these visitors there, and they just wanted to make an example and do away with that part of a place where a rendezvous, a holdout, where they thought possibly cattle thieves or horse rustlers.
They didn't show very good judgment, though, hanging 3 men with
very poor judgment, George. They sure wrong in that case. And the people of the old settlers, like my father and the boys that grew up there, the Flake boys, we all knew that was a very uncalled for foul deed. Most fiendish, heinous crime.
And
it was a good sample of lynch law.
Yeah, the vigilantes were composed of men from Holbrook?
Yes, 2 of them were out of Holbrook. I knew them well. 2 sheepmen.
And how many were there in the vigilante group?
There's about 5. And there was some men.
Pardon me, Smith. All right, to go on now, Joe. You were going to say that some men were from some other part of the country?
Yes, from along under the Tonto Rim. You put it under the Tonto Rim, that's enough.
Mm-hmm. From the Pleasant Valley area?
Yeah, Pleasant Valley, Tonto Basin country.
Mm-hmm.
3 of them were made up there and 2 from Holbrook. I knew that. I've been wanting to do that, but for the sake of the boys that's living, we won't mention any names. The characters have been... Hold up, I've got to be careful about that. They've been to our ranch just the day before.
Pardon?
They have been to our ranch, this committee, the day before. This vigilance committee.
Well, you don't want to record this?
I got it.
Well, we've pretty well covered the fields of the Graham Tewksbury Pleasant Valley War, unless you fellas have some other thoughts on that situation.
I haven't.
You don't do a group.
No,
Joe, you don't either?
No, not today.
Well, Joe, you know, the Pearce name appears on maps in several parts of the state. I understand that's your dad.
Yes.
And your family came in. Will you give us a history of your dad, his activities, and of your family, please?
Yes, I'd be glad to join you.
Thank you.
My father was born in Mississippi, and he migrated west, came up to Iowa, and my mother was born in the state of Iowa, and her people came west to Salt Lake City, and then came down south into Utah, southern Utah, down St. George country. And in about 1873, my father, James Pearce, my grandfather, Harrison Pearce, built a road from St. George south to the Colorado River, the mouth of the Grand Canyon. They hauled lumber in there, and they built ferry boats.
Was that Lee's Ferry?
The Pearce Ferry.
Oh, it came in Pearce.
That's known as the Pearce Ferry. They spelled the name P-I-R-C-E in writing of it, but it should be P-E-A-R-C-E, Pearce. And my grandfather operated the ferry until about 1882, and then he sold out. But my father and grandfather hired help, Indian help, and they built a road as an outlet for people who were coming in from Nevada and Utah to come across the river to go into California and to come into Arizona. They built the first road that was what is now Kingman, and helped to build a road from another road back towards Flagstaff. And they did this with Indian help to make it possible, an outlet for people crossing the ferry. My father and a man by the name of Roberts discovered a copper mine, a claim near Kingman, and they sold it for $1,800. My father took the money and went to the edge of Oregon, and he bought Cotswold sheep and brought the sheep and ferried them across the Pearce Ferry and brought them up and was in the sheep business with the Daggs brothers up on the Taylor, Arizona. And my father owned cattle, owned about 100 head of cattle. And when the hash knife came in there in 1885, it didn't take very long. I was riding with a hash knife wagon as a boy to take care of father's cattle. And it only took the outfit about 3 or 4 years to clean us out of the cattle business. I guess I wasn't a very good cowman. And I rode with the hash knife boys and I learned to speak the language of the cowboy and the cattle rustler. And that really equipped me in pretty good shape to enlist in the Arizona Rangers. But I'd like to say just briefly that I was in 1898, when President McKinley, through executive proclamation, set aside what was then known as the Black Mesa Forest Reserve, now the Sitgraves in the Apache National Forest. I was appointed chief ranger of that forest, and I had 10 forest rangers under me. And I had charge of that forest from 1898 to 1902. And my office was at Nutrioso, Arizona, and Springerville, and they established a forest office afterwards. But I held the job down for about 4 years, and during that time, through the help of Will C. Barnes, we farmed allotments for sheep and cattlemen on this forest. And we were created primarily at the time to fight forest fires. The local cattlemen and sheepmen, they fought fires to protect their own range, but up to this time the forest was unprotected.
Did you have trouble working out those allotments between the various outfits, both cattle and sheepmen?
At that time there was more sheep to handle on the forest than there were cattle, I believe. And I guess probably it's about evenly divided. The Flagstaff had a great number of sheepmen at the time, and it was just about evenly divided between sheep and cattle. And I put in that 4 years' time marking off and establishing allotments for the sheep and the cattle to make it agreeable between them. And then when the Arizona Rangers came in force, I had to show a chip on my shoulder. We'd been knocked out of our cattle, they just swiped out of them. And it didn't take very much encouragement for me to join the Rangers to try to clean up this terrible mess in Arizona. This forest. And we were created primarily at the time to fight fires. The local cattlemen, they fought fires to protect their own range, but up to this time the forest was unprotected.
Did you have trouble working out those allotments between the various outfits, both cattle and sheepmen?
At that time there was more sheep to handle on the forest than there were cattle, I believe. And I guess probably it's about evenly divided. The Flagstaff had a great number of sheepmen at the time, and it was just about evenly divided between sheep and cattle. And I put in that 4 years' time marking off and establishing allotments for the sheep and the cattle to make it agreeable between them. And then when the Arizona Rangers came in force, I had to show a chip on my shoulder. We've been knocked out of our cattle, they just swiped out of them. And it didn't take very much encouragement for me to join the Rangers to try to clean up this terrible mess in Arizona.
The rustlers had stolen most of your father's
Yes, they had. They'd stolen. They'd gotten off with our cattle. And revenge is mine, that's what I thought. And I wanted a little, excitement, and I really got it.
Well, now, you're talking about cattle. What kind of cattle did your father run?
Well, he ran a very good brand of cattle, and I'm proud to say that Dr. Brannan and Finney, his partner at Flagstaff, came over to our ranch at Taylor and bought the first bunch of cattle to start Dr. Brannan in the cattle business. He told us, I remember as a boy. And Ruby, I guess, knew Dr. Brannan and Finney.
Those are the Herefords that we were talking about last night.
These were Durham and Hereford cattle at the time. These were Durham. The father had Durham and Hereford cattle at the time.
Is that what the hash knife ran to?
No, the hash knife ran just one cross between the Chihuahua cattle of Chihuahua, Mexico, and the Hereford cattle. They're very light cattle. They're longhorn, and they were quite light colored, but not spotted. Not many spotted among them, but they were very light.
What do you mean, light red?
Lightweight, yes. The hash knife cattle brought about $8 for yearling steers and $10 for 2-year-olds, and about $12 for 3-year-old steers was a good price.
That was how much a pound?
That would be about 3.5 to 4 cents a pound. 3 cents.
Very much,
3 cents a pound. They're all sold by the head then.
Right.
They're all sold by the head. About
1, 2, 3 years, huh?
8, 10, and 12. I've seen many 1,000 head of big steers sell for $10 and $12 a head. 3-year-old steers.
How long would they keep their steers?
Well, they kept them for about 2 and 3 years old. They didn't sell many yearlings. No, they kept them. They wasn't worth handling to sell as yearlings. They kept them till they was.
Well, you say they were long horns. They weren't anything like the Texas
Not the old long Chihuahua horn, but they were a cross, but they were long horn. The cows were quite long horned, and the steers.
Probably horns 1.5 to 2 foot long.
Oh, they were a very big long rocking. They'd come along something. They weren't in the shape of the long horn and twisted out. You know, there is a long horn, but these horns came out properly and then came to a point.
They came out in front of the
steer's
head, right?
Not turned on out.
Did they turn together then or turn on out?
No, they remained about even as a rule, and had a little downward pitch on the end. Just
how far apart were they at the point, would you say?
Oh, I think probably 24 inches, something like that.
Now, how long would the horns be?
Well,
6 feet each, something like that?
2 foot.
2 foot.
2 foot, 3 or 4 inches.
3 or 4 inches.
An old steer on the prod could give you some trouble, couldn't he?
Oh, yeah.
They were, my understanding, those originated, they were the longhorns originated out of Mexico.
Yeah, they did.
We had them black and white.
They were just one cross.
They were pretty cattle.
That's the reason they brought all these thoroughbred Hereford bulls in there and crossed them with the longhorn.
Yeah. Well, we got a little digression there, but I think that's very interesting. I guess they were fast cattle, too, weren't they? Hard to handle on the range and wild.
They're just as hardy as goats. They live on where a goat could live. They live and breed. They're good breeders.
Dan Fane and I used to catch them for fun, saddle them and ride them. And I've had them run when I think it was a good racehorse for about a quarter of a mile. He had a very good run.
Were you riding a bareback room?
No, we'd saddle them. And we got a little venturesome one time. Dan put the saddle on backwards, and used the steer's tail for bridle. And he like to got the thickest on Dan before I could catch him. My mouth was a little slow.
You could hardly stay with the steer, huh? Where was that, up in Lonesome Valley?
No, that was over in what they call the Double Cabin Park.
Oh.
North there around Allen Lake in that country.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Well, listen, Joe, we digressed here. You were talking about your family and the history.
Yes, we got off from a little, but I'd like to say while we're on the hash knife just briefly.
Yeah, okay.
I was very familiar with the number of cattle, and according to the historians of the country, the hash knife shipped in about 40,000 head of cattle when they came in with them in 1885, and the herd run up the valley to about 60,000 head of cattle on the range. That's the honor conceded by the historians. Well, I might say just a little, George, further about that. My father was was a member of the Utah militia and served in the Ute War against the Ute Indians. And it was impossible to get soldiers into Utah. And my Uncle John Pearce was a colonel in the Utah militia of St. George, and my father was a lieutenant. And my mother drew a pension for father's services as a member of that militia. The government paid them a pension for those who served in that militia in the campaign against the Utes.
They earned it, too. When your father came down of the Pierce Ferry up north of Kingman on the Colorado River, you said he used Indians. Weren't the Indians a little bronco and berserk at that time, or were they easy to handle?
The Indians, well, they were very much there. They were very leery of the Mojave Apaches. They were a branch of the Apaches, and they were very leery of them, and they wouldn't hire, they wouldn't employ but just a very few that could, that seemed to be very peaceful. They paid these Indian horses to make the road. Father had the horses and grandfather, and they paid them to build this road.
Weren't they a little dangerous or a possibility for trouble with these?
But yes, they were. The Mojave Apaches, if they would have known that we were coming in to take their land, they'd have made a little trouble, I think, because they were pretty wild Indians. They just, as I remember them, they wore G-strings and had no clothes on them. They just wore
bow and arrows to hunt?
Well, the bows and arrows, yes. They all had bows and arrows, and they wore a G-string and no clothing.
Did they have tomahawks?
No tomahawks.
Didn't have any rifles either,
No,
I suppose.
no rifles.
And they were crazy to get horses, weren't they?
They were crazy for horses, and they did a lot of work. They must have had 10 or 15 of those Indians working there for horses. Father had quite a bunch of horses he brought with him. And they built that road. And now...
How far south did that road go?
It's come up to what is now Kingman. They built a road out that way. There's an outlet toward California, and the other was built up toward Hackberry and over to Flagstaff.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've heard stories. Some early-day cattleman there who used to put a little arsenic in the flour and leave it around for the Indians to use. Did you ever hear that?
No, I never did.
Supposed to poison them. They were stealing his cattle all the time, and he couldn't ferret them out, so he supposed to have gotten rid of some of them that way. Did you ever hear that story?
Yes. Oh, yes.
You think there's something to it?
Oh, unquestionably.
That happened in Kingman, and I also heard out near Little Colorado, somewhere out there.
I was just going to tell you that the Indians used to come into our camp after this happened. And it was hard. We couldn't feed them all because we just couldn't get grub. But we'd go to the drugstore and we'd get a skull and crossbones and put it on a bottle and get some salt and put in the bottle. And an Indian would come into camp, we'd shake hands with him, and soup pie or Navajo.
Where was this camp?
It would be...
Where were you ranging cattle in?
Back in around Canyon Diablo, and in close to the mouth of the San Francisco Wars. So we'd say, well, you're my friend, or you stay and eat dinner with me. And we'd say, now you see this flower here? If you ever come here, don't bother that flower, because there's a man out here, he's a mean man, he's a chindi, and means the devil in their language.
Yeah. That's a Navajo.
Yes. He poisoned that flower. Don't you bother swallow that. Now here's some good flour here. Take him out and show him that bottle, Get the fool with the bottle and show him that poison, and accidentally drop a little of that salt in the bread you was mixing up for something, and go on about your work and look up, and there wouldn't be an Indian in a mile of that camp. And that's the way you used to save grub. He worked all kinds of tricks those days to keep the friendship of the Indian and still save her food, because it's hard to get.
What kind of grub would you eat?
Well, we had beef and beans and bacon powder bread and blackstrap molasses. That's about all.
Didn't have canned goods in those days, of course.
Oh, no, that was a luxury. We couldn't eat canned goods. We just beef.
What kind of beans did you have? Were there pintos in?
Regular old red beans, red beans.
You did make sourdough bread, huh?
Yes, quite often. When we stayed in camp long enough, having an established camp, we had a little wooden keg. We put sourdough in that. Mm-hmm. Covered up kindly, and some of those fellows were experts at sourdough bread.
Well, that blackstrap molasses, that was really the dessert, wasn't it?
Yes.
Pretty fine stuff. Huh?
Barney Stiles was eating dinner at Roden's camp one time, and Barney had a kind of a nasal twang on his head, and he picked up a can of this blackstrap, and he was looking at it. Roden says, "What are you looking at?" "I'm just trying to see whose cornfield this earth grew in."
Well, you fellows didn't have any 40-hour week either, did you?
No.
What time did you go to work tomorrow? Daylight, wasn't it?
Well, we used to, if we was working for a company, we worked 16 hours and throw in 2 hours night guard. That is true. That is just about the regular day's work.
18 hours. That was on the roundup time.
Yeah. We were out at 4 wrangling horses. If we had a stray herd, why, we got to chunk somewhere out of the night of about an hour and a half to an hour and 20 minutes, depending on the number of the crew. 2 men to hold a herd of cattle out of the night, then 2 day herders in the daytime.
Well, you start out on some of those roundups, you wouldn't come in for lunch either, would you?
Oh, no, we'd never come in till we got the herd work.
You pretty dark a lot of times, wouldn't it?
Yes. We'd come out sometimes at daybreak, sometimes be night when we get to work.
Mm-hmm. How much did you get paid for that 18 hours a day?
$35 a month, $30 and $35.
$35 and pound. And you had to furnish your own saddle too, didn't you?
Oh yes, your saddles and your rope.
Yeah. Your bedroll.
Bedroll.
What Bronco busters get? Did they get a little more?
I don't know. A man rode a rough string, he'd probably get $35 a month.
Do you have to break several horses a week to keep in that category?
He earned his money. He earned that extra $5.
You generally have a bad one or two in your string. The horses in your detail to you. You do your own breaking.
Jack, by golly, we haven't had a chance to talk to you here much. We've been concentrating in northern Arizona, but we're going to get over to you.
That was interesting. I enjoyed that.
But we want to get over to you, too. Now, Joe, to get back to your family, your dad had built this road across Pierce Ferry and down into Kingman, and then east to Hackburn and west toward Needles. Then did he migrate on into the, we used to call the Mormon country up in the direction of St. John?
Yes, he blocked up under the Lot Smith colonists, and he stayed there a little while, and he wasn't satisfied with the little Colorado River, and he moved on up to what was Taylor, and he was the first settler that settled in Taylor. There wasn't a white man in the valley, and there's only one man, Jim Stinson, at Snowflake, when Father went in there, and that's where I met Jim Stinson. It took the cattle to Pleasant Valley. The Pleasant Valley War was started over with Jim Stinson's cattle. And Father took up the little town there and took up land at Taylor, and I was raised in Taylor. And now it's a town of probably 800 population.
Mm-hmm. Not near Springerville there.
Yeah.
And your father stayed there, and your mother until their
Father
death?
stayed there and died. Mother died there. Father died at the age of 83, and Mother died at the age of 93.
How old are you now, Joe, if you don't mind telling us?
I'll soon be 84.
Well, you look healthy, by golly. Do you have any brothers and sisters?
I have 4 brothers and 1 sister left. I have 4 brothers living. We had there was 5 brothers and 4 sisters. But at the present time, I have 3 brothers living and 1 sister.
Was your father a member of the Mormon church when he came west, or did he join them afterwards?
Yes, he was a member of the Mormon church. My grandfather was, and my father also.
Well, you've left a lot of history across the state. I know I heard somebody talking about the possibility of a monument to the memory of your dad at Pearce's Ferry along the highway there leading to it.
Yes, sir.
That should be done. Maybe we can get together and have something worked out on that a little later.
That's very good, George. I was in Kingman just a few days ago, about 10 days ago, and talked with Senator Cook there and put the matter up. And he's on a committee in the state to recommend the building of markers and highways, and he assured me that there'd be a marker placed in Kingman in honor of Father and Harrison Pearce, establishing the Pearce Ferry and building a fresh road into what is now Kingman.
Well, he certainly should be recognized and honored, and it'd be a tribute to you, too, who came after him, because you also certainly did a lot towards the development of the state. Well, I guess that covers the Pearce family, Joe, and we thank you an awful lot for your time and your kindness and your help. This is going to be perpetuated, this record we've taken this morning, and you've contributed a great deal. Thank you, Joe. Rube, would you like to tell us a little about your family? I know you're from part of the Drums, is it, in Stoneman Lake?
No, my father, his name was Lee Neal. He was born in just a few miles from Nashville, Tennessee. He was educated at St. Mary's College in Kansas and at Chillicothe School in Missouri. He was a lawyer of profession, and he was admitted to practice law in Kansas, also in the state of Texas. He married, my mother was born in Iowa and married in Coffeyville, Kansas. And they came from Coffeyville, Kansas to Stoneman Lake, and they settled at Stoneman Lake on the 9th day of August, 1876. They had a covered wagon and a yoke of oxen. They came from Coffeyville, Kansas to Stoneman Lake with the oxen and that covered wagon. My sister was about a year and a half old at that time. I was in 18...
How old were you, Rube?
I was born later, 1878. And near Camp Verde, Arizona. And we resided at Stoneman Lake. My father became ill, and we had to take him to Prescott. He was in Prescott for some length of time, and then came back and died at Beaver Creek in 84. He's buried at Central Verde. And my mother, later, when I was about 9 years old, she married a man by the name of Lyman S. Drum. He was a man that born in Pennsylvania and went to California in an early day and then made his way back into Arizona. And my sister later married a man that came in here who was a Hash Knife Cattle Company, Walter Durham, W.W. Durham.
Yeah, he was one of the original Hash Knife cowboys, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Your sister married Durham.
Yes.
That's how they came into the ownership of the Stoneman Lake.
Yes.
That's a beautiful spot up there.
Mm-hmm. There's a man by the name of Biffer, Frank Biffer. He was a mining man, and he had what they called a quick claim deed or a right on that land. Well, my mother came there, and he told her she liked the place and everything, and he told her, he says, I'm moving out, you take over. That was 12 years before the survey. The survey was in 1886. And when the survey was made, section 16, town 16 north, range 8 east, as a portion of the Stoneman Lake Ranch fell on that. Well, that was school land. Well, there we were on the school land, but we stayed there. Well, when the Forest Service took over, they come along and told us to move. And we told them no. They'd been there so long, it seemed like home. Breen was in charge of it. And, well, they kept bothering us. And let's see, what's his name? I keep forgetting. He's an insurance man, and he's married into your family.
Oh, Tom McCullough?
Tom McCullough.
Yeah.
Tom McCullough and my mother was, they were quite friendly, knew each other. Tom used to go out there occasionally. He told her, he said, Mrs. Drum, don't be in any hurry to move. He said, don't get in any dispute with anybody, but he says, just let them move you. He says, stay there. He says, seems to me like you ought to have a right. Length of time you've been there, he was there 16 years before the survey, and he says the map, the original survey, shows your cabin, Neil's cabin. He said, you got ample proof. And he said, you've undoubtedly manifest good intentions, so he says, I wouldn't hurry away. Well, Drake, Willard M. Drake, finally become supervisor, and of course he was only doing what he was told to do. He came out and told us to leave, and we didn't go. Well, I went to town and I wired Henry F. Ashurst. Ralph Cameron, in the meantime, was a representative, and Ralph, I talked to him a while, and he got Ballinger, and they kind of called a halt on the situation. And when I went to town, and I wired Ashurst, see if he could do something about stopping the removal. They came out and told us they'd have to move us. I've got the copy of the telegram that Henry sent Drake. He says, leave those old people at Stoneman Lake alone, or I'll move you. Signed Henry F. Ashurst, Senator. Well, then old man Clark, right north of Flagstaff there, you know, he was on 16 and in a similar position as we were. And John Loy there at Munns Park was on section 16, and exactly his case paralleled ours. There was three of us on school land, and we couldn't gain any title or any right. Well, Ashurst went down and was going to introduce a relief bill for all three of us. And Ballinger told him if he wouldn't do it, he thought they could settle it some other way. So Henry asked him what his proposition was. Well, he said, it's very simple. He said, just grant those people the right to file, make final proof at the same time, and get the title of that land. Well, that was just how easy it was. We got a little help. So we got Stoneman Lake Ranch. And
what did you do, run cattle there?
Yes, we had cattle there. We bought cattle that was on the old Star Line route, and they came from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Prescott with ox teams, and we'd buy up those cows. They'd get sore-footed, couldn't travel. We'd buy them up and put them in that soft dirt down the lake, and there was lots of grass and feed, you know, and their feet would grow out. And they were all colors. We called them hand-painted. They were several colors. You can imagine all colors of the rainbow, blue and red and all other. And
these were oxen, were they mostly?
Mostly cows that they were driving, you know, Mexican cattle.
I see.
Well, we raised quite a herd of those Mexican cattle. And they got out, and they were just like hornets, you know. They'd fight at the drop of a hat. They'd just chase you, and those had been worked, you know. They got mean after they run wild a little while. And we finally sold those or traded them to J.F. Daggs for some buildings, a home and a couple of buildings, one where commercial hotel stands now, we own that lot, and one adjacent to it there. A couple of buildings, one where the commercial hotel stands now, we own that lot, and one adjacent to it there. And there come a fire, if you remember, all about that time, and they took those buildings away. Well, we mortgaged the lots, put up another building, and rented it, and it burned down, and that took the family fortune. We haven't left.
Well, gee, that was too bad. But the family did wind up with the beautiful Stoneman Lake.
Oh, yes. We held Stoneman Lake. We got a title to it. And after years, when my father, he homesteaded the place on Section 9, that was one of these alternative sections. It's just inside the 40-mile limit. Section 9, and the water there was Railroad Spring.
You mean the 40-mile limit of those railroad tracks?
Yes, and it was reconveyed to the United States, and we had a survey made, and my stepfather homesteaded about 60 acres there at that spring. Well, the original homestead was 160 acres. One was on Section 9, and the other was on 16. So it gave us control of all that north side of the lake, or the east side of the lake, rather, and the northeast side.
Pretty valuable.
Yes, it was. And
with Indians?
Well, it used to come there. They had to fight 6 miles of us once, and then 4 miles another time.
Any Indians killed or white men?
Oh, yes, there were soldiers and Indians killed.
Oh, yeah.
And that calls to mind the fight between the White Horse Cavalry and the Apache Indians, which occurred on what is known as Battle Creek Ridge over near East Clear Creek. The soldiers and the Indians, they captured some of those Indians, and on the way back to Fort Verde, they stopped at Stoneman Lake. Well, we had a cellar there. We used to keep potatoes and stuff in, and a dirt roof. Part to build out of the ground, and rocks and logs. And it started raining, and we let the guards put about 6 Apache warriors in this cellar. Well, they just threw them in there, and they couldn't get anything to eat themselves. But Mother was always kind of sympathetic. She went and she got some dried meat, and she made a big pot of coffee, and baked up some bread, took it out there to the guards, and they had a lantern, and they took it in the cellar, and she gave it to these Indians. And there's a young Indian sitting there, and he got up, and he took a string of beads off his neck, and he put them, just dropped them over Mother's head, and turned to interpreters there, one of the scouts, and told her to tell Mother to keep those beads and wear them whenever there was Apache Indians around, to wear those beads, particularly if they acted warlike or anything, to put them on, and they wouldn't harm her. And, we think till this day that probably saved my mother and my sister and I, probably saved her lives. Because those Indians several times come and looked in that ranch, but they didn't come down. They went on.
What kind of beads were they, Rube?
Well, I haven't yet part of them. Somebody stole a portion of them, but they were made out of roots and painted with some kind of an Indian paint. I have some bread, and took it out there to the guards, and they had a lantern, and they took it in the cellar, and she gave it to these Indians. And there's a young Indian sitting there, and he got up, and he took a string of beads off his neck, and he just dropped them over Mother's head and turned to interpreters there, one of the scouts, and he told her to tell Mother to keep those beads and wear them whenever there was Apache Indians around, to wear those beads, particularly if they acted warlike or anything, to put them on, and they wouldn't harm her. And, we think till this day that probably saved my mother and my sister and I, probably saved their lives. Because those Indians several times come and looked in that ranch, but they didn't come down. They went on.
What kind of beads were they, Rube?
Well, I haven't yet part of them. Somebody stole a portion of them, but they were made out of roots and painted with some kind of an Indian paint. I have a string of them. I'm going to give them to some institute later on. They mean a good deal to me now, but I'm the only one with family left.
We're building a museum up in Flagstaff, Museum of Pioneer Historical Museum.
Well, I'd like to give it to.
It ought to be up there.
Yeah, I'd like to give it to Flagstaff.
And I'll have the story with it too. That would be very.
And we'll take a little story it was, but we feel certain that that one act saved our lives. Now, we believe that Indian was educated. We believe there were several of them sent to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and came back well educated, spoke excellent English and everything. And Mother always said that she thought that Indian understood every word she said. He's too polite and everything to have been an uneducated Indian.
Rube, now, how did you happen to get into the Rangers and get that badge number 20 I saw you wearing last night?
Well, I'll tell you. They was stealing cattle in Coconina County, Yavapai County. They were stealing all around in Flagstaff, and I was working for Jim Johnson for sheriff. He was sheriff, and I was working for him as a deputy. And he wanted me to spend more time at fighting stock rustlers. Well, I told him, I said, I can't do it on the wages you pay, $75 a month then was the deputy sheriff's wages. And we talked around, and finally Jim says, well, why not join the Rangers? And he says, they'll give you a little more, and he says, you come here and I'll help you out a little bit, and they can go ahead. Well,
how much was it the Rangers paid you?
Paid $100.
Oh, boy.
And Charlie Babbitt, and Tom Pollock, Martin Buglin, they came to me and said, now you take the job and we'll help you a little bit. And I said, all right. Well, T.C. Fryer and Roden come in then and said they'd help a little. Well, I said, how about maybe I can't get the job? Well, they'd look after that part of it, too. So I got a telegram in a few days from Tom Reining to meet him in Phoenix, and I came down here and he swore me in, and I was a Ranger.
Did you have a special oath?
Yeah, no, it's used for defend all the laws of the United States and the Constitution and all the laws of the state of Arizona. And that was about the only oath they had.
I've lived as a soldier in the Arizona Rangers.
About the only instructions I got, there was a lieutenant by the name of Dave Allison. He was an old Texas Ranger. And he, by the way, he was a good officer, too. There was no foolishness about him or no show or anything. He was just a natural officer. And he said, Neil, he says, I never burden a man with instructions. He says, I won't enlist a man unless I think he's got sense enough to hold the job. And he says, when I'm gone, you can't use my head, so you'll have to use yours. But he said, there's one thing that I want to tell you. if you go out here, he said, and pick up a rabbit and hold it in your arms, he says, watch it. It might turn to a wildcat. If it does, it'll scratch you all to pieces. And that thing, I'm satisfied, saved my life 2 or 3 times. He meant by that, if you ever arrest a man, no matter who he is, watch it and don't go to sleep on the job. And I think that was the best advice I ever got from an officer. The best instructions was those few words.
Did you enlist for a period of years? Or?
1 year each time. Yes.
What do you think was the most exciting experience you had, Rube?
Well, I'll tell you, if you want to know the time that I was the worst frightened, it's a very simple thing, but I'm going to tell you that I was really scared. There was J.D. Bailey and J.L. Doherty. You knew Lou Doherty, of course.
You were on the CO office.
Yes.
Yeah, Lou Doherty.
Well, he and I and Bailey started to go up around Monticello and Moab and in there to look for some stolen horses. And we were crossing the reservation, and a couple little Indians rode up to us and riding double on a horse, you know, and Bailey was always chewing tobacco. So he took a big bite off from plug of Climax tobacco, you know, and started to put it back, and the Indian thought it was something to eat, of course. So he motioned to Bailey, and Bailey cut him off chew, and he cut that other little Indian boy off chew of that Climax tobacco, you know, and it was enough to kill a man. To make good sheep dip. And that little fella, he swallowed his, and in about 15 minutes, I believe that was the 6th person I ever saw in my life. He's just about the color of one of those pillows there. And there we were. Doherty was cool, very collected fellow, you know, but I could see that he was uneasy. And I said to Doherty, we better stop and see if we can do something for that child, because I believe he's going to die. So we pitched a camp right close to this Navajo house. Well, they come out there, and there this little fellow had him laying in the shade of a boulder on some blankets to be spread out there, you know, and I was getting a can of condensed milk out of the pack, and Doherty wanted some water. And I put this milk in there and put a little salt in and got the boy to drink. It wasn't long till he disgorged that stuff, and we'd done that about 3 times, and he began to look better. But in the meantime, the Navajos was shushing around there, talking about Coyote's friends and everybody else, and about killing the white men. And
Coyote's friends, what do they mean by that?
Well, they hate a coyote, and if they don't like a man, well, he's a friend to a coyote.
I see. Uh-huh.
And so they were talking there, and my hair, I could just feel it going straight up, because I knew if that child died, that the sheep would have just as much chance killing the butcher as we would have of getting away from those Indians out there instead of that run. Well, there was about 15 around in this settlement, and they could have set up a smoke signal, and there'd been 300 after us in an hour.
Where were you? Way out in the wilderness?
Way out in the edge of the Monument Valley.
Oh, yeah.
And everywhere. And really, we had time to think all this was going over, but it may look foolish, but I was frightened and decidedly scared.
Well, I don't blame you. You get a bunch of Navajos milling around.
And
when was that? About what year was that?
That was in 1903.
They were still pretty primitive up there.
Yes, they were. And Bailey, after we was saying that the little child was going to live,
Then he took a long breath, and he says, you know, I've given away my last chew of tobacco. He says, I wouldn't give my grandmother chew of tobacco from now on. And it was so sincere. He meant it. He was scared too.
Well, you fellas were just about gone until that kid had died. Huh?
Yes, they'd got ashore. And that was an instance, I believe, though I've been, the man, of course, been frightened several times.
You ever been shot at, Rube? Well, Rube, we were talking about your history as a ranger, and I asked you if you'd been shot at. We had to change the coil there. We just ran out of that one spool. And you said you had. Would you mind talking about those?
You can see this scar?
On your nose there, right where your eye?
Yes.
Yeah, right where your glasses come.
That was a .38 bullet.
Went right through your nose?
No, it glazed it. Hit something and ricocheted. I think it hit a fender on a car. That's it. And there's a little white spot up there that that just took a lock of my hair for a keepsake. What was that? .38 bullet out of the same gun. I got.
The Lord must have had his hand on your shoulder. What was the occasion?
Well, I was just going to jail in Winslow. I was going to jail with a Mexican. And he was a kind of a notorious character, all into trouble, you know, just petty trouble. And I was taking him along, paying much attention to him because it's a habit of his getting in jail and getting sobered up. So going along, everything was going nice and friendly, and all at once somebody said, let him loose. And I looked up, and this fellow leveled a gun, and I went to the ground. And that's when I got both of these. And I wasn't trying to pull any Lone Ranger stunt or anything. I just come out with a gun and shot where I thought he'd ought to be. And he must have had that gun in front of him because it cut this thumb off, this joint of his finger, cut 3 joints, finger off of his right hand. And that saved my life. He dropped the gun. But he had another amigo there somewhere, and he hit me with something, but he was the boy that won the battle, whatever. He hit me with it. I went down and out, and there was a doctor living in the hotel there, and the chief hotel belonged to Girardi Brothers.
Yeah, I know that.
Well, he stuck a gun out the window and hollered at this fellow, and they both run. And he come down and helped me. I'd got on my feet at that time, you know, but this place was a-bleeding, and head was a-stinging there a little bit. And he patched me up, and I went on and worked for daylight, and then I went on and stayed to stay.
Well, thing like a couple of .38 bullets wouldn't stop you, huh?
No, it did.
Did you ever have to kill anybody on your line of duty?
No, I shot a poor fella, but he was shooting at me. Charlie Adams and I went. Charlie was a constable. And we went to arrest a man, and he shot one of these 32s on a 45 frame, you know, and the Frontier models. He put powder in my eye, but he shot right between mine and Charlie's head. He come near to me, I guess he did Charlie, because I had a lot of powder taken out of my eye. And I shot just a little after he did. I hit him. Fortunately, didn't kill him. I hit him in the leg. And he dropped. Charlie went to step, and there was a ditch just dug there. Had been there but a short time, and he went to step and fell into that and groaned, and I thought Charlie was killed. Well, this fellow wasn't any use to shoot him again because his gun was on the ground, and he was hurt, so I just waited there, and Jim Kennedy, he was the constable, and he run out there, and he saw this fellow. His name was Calistio Ivaro, And he says, this Severo, he says, well, you finally got into it, didn't you? And I said, Jim, you know this fellow? He says, he's in trouble all the time. And that was, well, the poor fellow's up and around in about 10 days, and I was truly glad of it. I wouldn't even sign a complaint against him. I let him go on. He was over here close to the Black Canyon, coming down the old Black Canyon road. He had him a little light wagon and a couple old mules that he drove around. And he'd lean back over this seat, and he carried a gun in a shoulder holster. And he leaned back to pick up something, and this gun dropped out of that shoulder holster and struck a hammer on a lump of salt, and shot him right in the head and killed him. And he carried six shells in that gun, you know, and that was a very dangerous thing to do with a frontier gun. And that's what become of him.
They get careless, don't they?
But that's the only mix-ups that I got into, and fortunately they both living. I expect well, one of them went to Gallup and was killed. One of the fellows that I had trouble with went there, and D. Roberts killed him, an officer, sheriff there. So I told him when he left, I said, if you, Alonzo, I said, if you leave here and go to Gallup, he told me he was going to Gallup. I said, you go to Gallup, and D won't look for any soft spot if he shoots at you. I said, he or Bobby the one will kill you the first move you make, because your reputation's going to follow you. And I said, those boys play for keeps. Well, he went down there, and he got drunk, you know, and Bob wasn't feeling very good, and Lorenzo aggravated him or something, and he just put him out of his misery. And I didn't like that idea myself. If I wanted to feel, George, that if I took a poor fellow's life, I wanted to feel that he made me do it. That was all.
I think that was probably the idea and philosophy of most all the Rangers, wasn't it?
I think so. We had one or two that I'm afraid was a little trigger happy.
Yeah, I've heard of one.
The average man that went in there, and I like Jack and Joe and myself, forgot half the time we had a gun.
Well, that's probably one reason you're alive today, too.
Never bothered anybody.
Jack, want to sit over here, please? Jack, we've been taking these guys from the northern end of the state. We haven't had a chance to get around to you. Nice you to sit by here patiently.
I've enjoyed it myself. Yeah, but I'm a poor storyteller, especially about myself.
Jack told us some very interesting stories last night. We won't delay very long, but
no.
I'd like to get your background to your going into the Rangers, your reasons for doing so.
Well, I first came to Wilcox in '89 to my uncle's ranch, Captain W.H. McKittrick, the G.H.
I've heard the name, you bet.
He was the son-in-law of General Shafter. Shafter was stationed at Fort Grant, and the home ranch of McKittrick was only 12 miles from Fort Grant. And he married General Shafter's daughter. Well, I was raised on the ranch there, and I first got to know Harry Wheeler, as I told you last night. You got that whole thing.
Yes, I got that,
Yeah. For playing baseball with the soldiers, against the soldiers at Fort Grant.
Yeah, I remember that.
And we became good friends. And when he enlisted in the Army, the first place he came was down at the ranch, because he knew that I'd fixed him up with a darn good pack horse. He wanted a pack horse, which I did. I had a dandy. And Harry Wheeler Captain Wheeler didn't have a lot of experience, but I showed him how to tie his bed on with a diamond hitch, or the squaw hitch.
Oh, yeah.
And on the diamond hitch on his pack animal, and we became friendly. And I used to see a lot of Harry. I did some confidential work, which was strictly confidential work, and he offered me a job as a ranger. And I served 2 enlistments. I served up until the time that the Rangers were disbanded. Most of my work was done around Naco and Wilcox in the southern part of the state.
What do you think was the most exciting or interesting moments you had in your career?
Well, I don't know. There's 2 or 3. One was when Captain Wheeler sent me, detailed 2 men with me to go to Wilcox and straighten out this train robber Downing.
I've heard of that, yeah.
Well, he was on the warpath up there, and Judge Page was a justice of peace, and they could get nobody to swear to a complaint. The local constable was up in Arabica Canyon, up above Hooker Ranch, so Judge Page wired to Wheeler to send some of the Rangers up there. Well, Wheeler detailed me to go up there and take 2 men with me to straighten Downing out. And I think that was one of the... it was a tough man I was going against. If I'd known now what I'd known then, he had another name. He was a bad one from Texas. And I don't know. It might have been different. But anyway, he was sober when we got there, and nothing developed out of it. The Justice of Peace, Judge Page, wanted me to swear to a complaint, and I refused to do it because he had not committed any crime that I knew of. I couldn't arrest him. I didn't have anything on him. So we got out of that pretty good. But it was a good tense moment there. And Wheeler backed me up in what I did after I returned to the headquarters at Naco. He said I was right. I had no right at all to take any action where the Justice of Peace, in other words, the Justice of Peace had it chilled in him. He was afraid. Billy Speed afterwards, a short time afterwards, Billy Speed, who was a ranger, shot and killed Downing in self-protection. Downing, when he was buried, they just got an old packing box, put him in the packing box, and took him out somewhere, dug a hole, put him in.
He was a bad actor.
Oh, he was a bad one. You knew Downing, Stiles' partner and Alvoyd's partner, and you also knew Downing. He was one of the worst down there.
Oh, Stiles and Alvoyd, those are the old boys over in Tombstone, weren't they?
Well, this was his partner. Downing was one of the gang.
Oh, yeah.
See, there was that gang of 3 that used to run together.
And he was a bad actor.
Oh, he was a bad one. And the other one was the one I told you last night about the killing of Arnett in the canyon there. We knew that he was going down one of these 2 canyons. Wheeler and I knew that he was coming down it. And Wheeler went to one canyon where he was supposed to come with Hum, the deputy sheriff and the constable from Lowell, and I took the other canyon. Well, it was the time we waited for that horse. The sound of the horse coming was a pretty tense moment, I can tell you that. There's nothing to it. It was darker than a cat.
Well, were you fellas the ones that the Governor Hunt called out to load these so-called wobblies and the train get them out of the station?
No, that occurred in 1917, I think it was, which was a long time after. I'm familiar with that because I was in Lowell working for the Calumet and Arizona Mining Company, in charge of the warehouse down there in the supply department during that time. But as luck would have it, I was offered a job as secretary of the state's prison at that time, and I was not present in Lowell at the time that this deportation took place. I knew it was coming up.
George, pardon me, was that Governor Hunter or Governor?
No, Governor Tom Campbell.
Campbell, I didn't know.
Tom Campbell. Tom Campbell was the governor. Harry Wheeler.
The old George the 8th kind of turned over.
Harry Wheeler was well, they were the old IWW gang.
Right, yeah.
But they got a whole lot of good, honest-to-goodness, clean, straight citizens in that deportation.
Poor Tom Foster, for instance, he walked out of their foot. Inspector for 20 years.
Yeah, there was an awful bunch of people in there.
I didn't want to meddle, but it was Tom Campbell that...
Yeah, I've seen the song, right?
And poor old Governor Hunt, they accused him of a lot of things.
Yeah. He's a great friend of Dad's, but
yes, he was a great friend of everybody. That's what kept him in office.
Yeah.
Well, after the war in 1917 started, I resigned as secretary up at the prison and enlisted in the army, in the regular army down at Douglas.
Now you fellows, you and Rube, are sitting down here in the Valley of the Sun enjoying life like a bunch of millionaires. That's wonderful, Jolly.
Well,
we're happy for you.
We've had a pretty rough time of it all the way through. That is not a rough time. It was a good time. You don't think of the old rough times now. You just think of the good times you had.
What other duties did you have, Jack, besides watching cattle rustlers and these evildoers? Was there any other specific job that would be assigned to you?
We had general police duty. Now, for instance, one time I was coming down from Wilcox down going to Naco, and I came in through Pierce, and from Pierce down to Gleason. And when I got to Gleason, the constable there, John Bright, told me, he said, I wish you'd stay over tonight. We're going to have a dance here, and I think I got a little bit more than I can handle. And he said, there's a man and a woman living together back here in the hills that come into these dances, and he gets on the dance floor with a gun on. And I'd sure appreciate it if you'd take that gun away from him. Well, I said, you're the constable here. Well, he says, you're a territorial ranger. Now that was strictly I just cite that as an incident. Well, we took the gun away from him, all right, and the man and his partner left the hall. That was all. But it was general. Anything you'd run onto, you had. Now, for instance, Billy Speed and I were when we were going up to Cave Creek to do police duty up at Cave Creek. We camped one night at Hooker's Hot Springs, which is over in the Galora Mountains, up the north end of the Happy Valley in there. And we camped there, and lo and behold, after we got ready to go out and pack out and go over the mountain, we met a boy. It was just a young fellow. Maybe he was 9 or 10 years old. Was just crying his heart out. And he took us over to an old shack that was there, and his father had died the night before with tuberculosis. Now,
the kid was there all by himself.
All by himself. And that was Billy Speed, and I made a box for him and buried the old man right in there. Now, that's just what we'd take it as it came.
You never knew what you were liable to run into.
No.
Did they give you fellows any consideration to get a pension or anything for having been at the Rangers?
Now? Yes, we're on a pension now. The legislature, we've only had it for 2 years.
You see, we had certain rights, ours, and when there was much doubt, we never knew. There was never anything done to protect our rights. And anyway, we rightfully had claim against the state of Arizona. As same as if a man was paid now Social Security, or he pays in on Social Security. You see, we worked under a working contract. We were really entitled to some care considerations because we were enlisted men.
We were
we brought that to the attention.
Federal, because we were a territory, and it was federal funds that were running the territory.
We figured that we had around $25,000 of indebtedness against the state when we figured there's 91 men served, and figured up the time, the length of time they served and everything, and the state hadn't been out $500 altogether on the obligations they owed us, they had our money. And we didn't know where we don't know to this day what become of it or what disposition was made or anything. They just mustered us out, and that was all they said. And when we got back and proved to the satisfaction of the legislature that we had a complaint, they figured there's 91 men served, and figured up the time, the length of time they served and everything, and the state hadn't been out $500 altogether. Had our money, and we didn't know where. We don't know to this day what become of it or what disposition was made or anything. They just mustered us out, and that was all they said. And when we got back and proved to the satisfaction of the legislature that we had a complaint, the Senate voted unanimous. The House missed a vote. The poor fellow was as strong as far as he died the day before we come to a vote. So it was a unanimous situation.
Just 2 years ago, huh?
Yeah,
Just 2 years ago.
We got out. Now we feel this way, that we were in the United States service, enlisted men. Our government was practically United States government. The governor was appointed by the president.
Right.
All our representatives were elective, but all our government, our judges and everything, was federally appointed, and we were directly subservient to their orders, and we still feel that we've got just the same rights as a soldier. We subject to a call. We protected the government on the international line. A good portion of Jack's duties, a good portion of mine, and a portion of Joe's were international work. And how in the world the government could escape the responsibility, I don't know.
They haven't recognized your claims yet.
We've never made a claim.
So you've never made a claim?
I believe that it would have to be adjudicated by the comptroller in Washington. But I think we got a legitimate claim.
Why don't you take it up with Hayden while he's still in there in the
Hayden's our man, all right.
Appropriations Committee? You'll never get a better
Carl
protector than Hayden right there.
Any possible chance he'd do it.
Yeah, I'm sure he would.
There's another thing about, just briefly now, I want to show you a position an officer's in. I'm turned loose to protect the general public. That's the primary purpose of an officer.
Peace officer.
All right, I go out and I get too tolerant. I allow a man to do things he shouldn't. Now this Mexican is shooting at me. And if I hadn't to fought back, if I'd let him go, he might have killed you the next day, or accidentally killed somebody else, you know. I'm responsible for your death. Because if I'd have done my duty, done what I was paid for, fulfill my oath, you'd have been alive today. They said you shot you.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's the position you're in. You don't, there are officers that get trigger happy. But when a man, I feel this way, when a man hasn't got intestinal fortitude enough to enforce the law, you never ought to take the oath, they never ought to pin a badge on it.
Well, that's a pretty high view to take of it, if that's true.
It's cold.
Sure.
Because if I neglect my duty, there's some good man going to get killed in a hold-up or something.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
If I tell a man here, I don't want to be presumptuous or anything, but I'm responsible for the man who runs the corner grocery store. If I catch you hold him up, I'm going to put you in jail, or I'm going to dispose of you in some manner so you won't do it anymore because you might kill a man. Well, that's logic, and that's good.
The public look forward to the fact because you're a peace officer for that protection, too.
But they don't, the average public don't look like you. The average public looks at an officer. They want him to wait till he's shot all to pieces before he does anything. And if he does anything, they're inclined to choose him this way. They're too sympathetic. The American people are too sympathetic. They say, well, now, what to do? The poor fellow didn't steal. He broke in a building. He only stole a suit of clothes. Well, I guess if they'd have been $10,000 diamond or something laying on the dresser, he wouldn't have taken that.
If he steals suit of clothes, he'd steal anything.
They'd still give him sympathy, you know. Well, those things, that's where the public falls down on an officer. Now, there's another thing. It's not so much the amount of crime you apprehend, but the amount of danger and stuff that you prevent. Now, an officer might have to arrest a lot of people. You might have a lot of trouble, like I did in Flagstaff. I had an awful time there because there was a bunch of people that was bootlegging. And it wasn't the liquor. I wasn't supposed to liquor George or anything. But you take a good bootlegging joint, it's just like a cesspool. It breeds disease, and crime is just on the same manner. You take and let a vice be a happening, a bootleg, and let it go. The class that's going to congregate around it is the troublemakers of your community. And the next thing you know, somebody's killed. Then you go down in your pocket and pull out money to help prosecute him. It takes $5,000 to prosecute a murder.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yes. Well, now, you know, I was in Flagstaff quite a number of years. You never tried a man for murder in the time that I was an officer. There wasn't anybody killed. All right, I went out and Cooper went in. There was 2 murders inside of 30 days. And
you know, they used to respect you, Rube. I know that.
It cost the Coconina County at least $10,000 to catch and prosecute those 2,000 murders. And now it's not criticizing anybody, but it wasn't so much what I'd done, but what I prevented, what I kept other people from.
Well, I've got the same thing when Speed and I were up at Cave Creek as rangers. There wasn't a crime committed up there. Everything was just, and we hadn't been gone 2 days until there was a murder up there.
Your preventative force, certainly, a good moral force. Well, you know, we were talking about cowboys a little while ago, and you remember this morning at breakfast where you mentioned something about the old days when there weren't enough women to go around and you fellows had dances. How did you work that? I'd like to know a little more about that. You still had your dances even though there weren't enough women, isn't that it?
Yes, we'd pick out some man, you know, and just tie a handkerchief on his arm and hang on to him, go to dancing. And
he'd be the lady, huh? And
yes.
What was it, square dancing?
Square dancing or waltz or
there was
any kind of a dance.
There was square dances and waltz in those days, and polkas.
Yes, polkas.
And there's a Suviana.
Oh, yeah, they did that.
Oh, yes, it was
waltzes, you know, they call Summer Las Olas.
Summer Las Olas, yeah.
And it's almost the same as over the ocean waves. That's what it means. That the 2 tunes, the one in America and over the ocean waves, is a little different from the Summer Las Olas.
Well,
almost the same tune.
Did you ever have any dances when there weren't any women at all?
No, we just get together. Maybe, lots of times, maybe they'd be in a crowd where there was a couple hundred people, women all around or something, you know, and then we'd get to playing or something, they'd grab some man, start to waltzing around through the crowd.
There was no such thing as tag dances in those days. You had a partner and She was yours. And sometimes the other guy tried to get her, and he'd liable to get pushed out the front door.
Mrs. Dickinson used to be, well, she was Billy Dickinson's wife. She was just as fun as anybody could ever get in the world, you know.
Yeah.
And she'd dance, and she could jig dance too, you know. Some of those fellows would go and get to dancing with her. We called her Nellie, just she was raised right. She was Patty, you know, and we'd all raised together, and we never thought to call her Mrs. Dickinson. We'd call her Nellie, and we'd go and say, come on, Nellie, let's wake the crowd up. We'd start down around one of those big halls, you know, and dancing, and particularly if he'd stag a polka, you know, or some of those odd-skip jumps, and we had wonderful times.
Yeah, good old simple times. You didn't have radio or TV or a lot of things.
Fiddler only, fiddler and the guitar.
And I
danced all night, too.
All night long.
Yeah. I feel that the state of Arizona has truly been kind to me, Joe.
That's the way it will be.
Fine. Joe, there's one thing you were talking about, Will Barnes. What was he doing out in Arizona?
Will Barnes.
That's the old historian.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, he was quite an historian, Will was, and what gave Will his big reputation, he was telegrapher, an old Fort Apache, for the United States government. And one of the troop of cavalry was out, and they was out on march, and the Indians were threatened to come and take over the old Fort Apache. They'd threatened to come in there and take it, and I guess they would have taken it. And the commanding officer, I think his name was Colonel Bacon, he asked Will Barnes if he would carry a message to the man in charge who was on that campaign against the Apaches. And he was someplace way down here on Clear Creek. And to take a message to him, to have him come in with part of his men at least, or what he could, to come back to the fort to help hold the fort. And Will Barnes carried this message and delivered it to this commanding officer, and the troops got back in time to save the fort. That's how he got his first big...
People started hearing about the name then. Then
there's an English company came in there in the name of Cowman, and Benham, and Swinburne. 3 Englishmen. They had a little money, and they formed a cattle company called the Esperanza, E-S-P-E-R-E-N-Z-A, Esperanza. That's the Hopeful, the name in English, the Hopeful Cattle Company. And they had a ranch just below Holbrook, about 20 miles below Holbrook. Well, Barnes had a little bit of money, but he put his money into that English company, and they called it that, and they gave Barnes the foremanship, or general manager of that company. And they ran up to a good band of cattle, and probably owned about 5,000 head at one time.
Very good operation, then.
Oh, yes, it paid off well. And then finally they divided up, and Will C. Barnes, it's a peculiar thing how popular he grew. He grew soon. He was a very able writer, and he wrote about the cattle business.
I have several of his books. Longhorns and Spurs, I believe, is one.
Yes.
Arizona place names.
Yes.
Very famous in the Arizona history.
Yes, very famous. And he became soon the secretary of the National Livestock Association at Denver. He was quite an able speaker, Barnes was, too. And then from that, he became a secretary of the Livestock Sanitary Board here at Phoenix. And then later, he was appointed. He'd written so much on grazing and cattle that he received the appointment as Assistant United States Chief of Grazing in the United States Forest Service, chief of grazing. And he held that for a number of years in Washington, and he had the whole nation to look after as grazing. And then when he went out of that position, why, he named another man there, Bert Potter of Holbrook. You know him.
Oh, yes.
And he became...
Well, he's hash knife man.
And he became chief of grazing for a number of years. Two cattlemen out of Holbrook. To think of that, they'd hold that responsible positions on the great number of cattle there was in Holbrook, Flagstaff, and Winslow country. That these men had a great deal to say about cattle, and to think those two men were chosen in the United States to lead our government was remarkable.
Another Arizona man, Joe, the old F. Knight from Prescott.
Yes.
Chief of grazing a long time.
He
He is one of the best, and the Forest Service had most level-headed man on grazing it. We had. Of course, Bert Potter was good.
Bert was good.
You bet he was. But so was Knight. They only had this advantage of Bert. He's an accountant, you know. He had a wonderful education. And Bert was just like the rest of those cowpunchers, you know. We went through school one day when they was having vacation.
Where you got educated, huh? Barnes, when he was working with you on those allotments and the forest that you were talking about 2 minutes ago.
Yes, I worked with Barnes.
What was his capacity then? Was that when he was chief of grazing?
Yeah, he's chief of grazing,
Pardon me, Smith. Well, we've all had a wonderful and interesting get-together, I think. I don't believe we're going to impose on you fellows any longer. We've been in this session for about 2 hours, 2 hours and a half. We sure enjoyed being with you all.
Have you accomplished anything?
Oh, I've had a wonderful time, and I've gotten a lot of very valuable history, and I never did have a complete insight and understanding of the Arizona Rangers, which I have now.
On the spot. The talks here from these two boys on that northern area.
Yeah.
That was interesting. I like that myself.
We got you last night on the southern area pretty well, so
yeah.
We've got a pretty well-rounded understanding and overall viewpoint of the activities and operation of the Arizona Rangers. And we surely thank you for all getting together, and Rube helped me arrange this, and I'm doubly grateful to him for all his kindness.
What little I done, I'm delighted to do it, and I want to acknowledge one of the nicest times that I've had in a number of years.
Well, we've all had it.
First time, George, we've been together for this morning, we had to talk about 2 hours. First time we've been together alone, and we really enjoyed it.
Well, I thought you would. Well, sure wonderful.
You should have heard that 2 hours about we had sitting out in the car on the fat there. That was good.
I bet. Well, maybe we'll get together in the next few weeks again when it's convenient with everybody, and possibly get Oliver. Let's see, Oliver
Palmer.
Oliver Palmer.
P-A-R-M-E-R.
Oliver Palmer was the one at Patagonia who couldn't make it.
Yeah.
He's about 80-some years old, is he? Oh, he's Tucson. Oliver Palmer's a Tucson.
Oliver's Tucson.
And the man at Patagonia?
About 82 years old, C.L. Beatty.
C.L. Beatty.
Beatty.
Uh-huh. He's not too well, is he?
No. I'll tell you, he's an Indian boy.
Is he?
He's a Chippewa Indian.
Oh, yeah.
And he and I were partners for about 18 months. And he's one of the nicest fellows, most congenial guys that I was ever out with around.
Well, it'd be nice if we could all get together. It might be a little later on. We could possibly load ourselves in the car and go on down to Beatty and have Oliver come on down to Tucson. If Joe can get down from Eager, he's got the farthest to go of any of us.
We go to Patagonia sometime, and we get him, you know. And he's quite good. He was a good officer, I can tell you. And where he was valuable, he was a good trader. And we had a dog They got the dog was out of the penitentiary in Georgia. So they brought 3 of them in here and they gave me one. And that dog, we used to train it. They'd get up in the morning and take his mules, his outfits, go on down the road, and I'd hold up 2 or 3 hours, and he'd take a cut off. We both knew the country pretty well. And I'd turn this dog loose. They had trained the slow train, just trot along, then once in a while look back, see if you was coming. And that dog, he'd train those mules for 35, 40 miles in a day. Lots of times he'd done that, you know.
Well, you'd have to trail people once in a while.
Yes, oh yes.
Or get an evildoer, huh? Cattle thief or something sort.
That's the dog. The little girl was lost up there in the cowman. And Uncle Jim Owens, he was of that buffalo.
Yes, I've heard of Uncle Jim.
Well, he told me, he said, now just don't get excited, just wait. He put a boy on a horse, and he said, you go where those rangers are camped. Tell them this little girl's lost, bring their dog. I picked the dog up in front of me, they hand him up. We loped over there. It's about 2.5 miles to the camp for us. And the first thing, the dog looked for the little girl because she'd been petting him the day before. He walked around there a little bit. I said, say, go on, find her now. And he started out, trotted along. And I just rode, I told him, I said, now, if I shoot, don't get excited. I said, if I find a little girl, I said, I'll shoot a couple times. And it took down through the quick and ash trees, different places, you know, where the timber was thick, right off towards the Grand Canyon, and almost in a tangent. The dog would trot along, and all at once she began to get anxious, you know, and wanted to go. And finally she broke loose and run, and there was a log that the bark had shelled off, you know, and the little girl had crawled over that. And she run, put her feet up on that log, and I see a little hand come up, you know, that dog.
That made you feel good, didn't it?
Yes, I got on, and I said, Betty, where are you going? She says, hunting, Mama. Well, I said, we'd better ride.
She wasn't afraid at all,
No, I told her, I said, you better not walk any further. Yes, she said, I'm tired, so. And the saddle, I said, now, Betty, wait, I'm going to shoot. I said, we want to tell Mama.
How long has she been lost?
Oh, she'd been gone then about 3 hours.
Uh-huh.
And so I shot a couple times. Uncle Jim, he answered me, and he told us, he's utter, he's safe. Come riding in, you know, they wanted that dog. They'd give me everything they had in the world for that dog. It's something to save the little girl's life.
Oh, it's wonderful. Well, you know, the men have been doing a lot of talking. I know Jack Redmond here is married because we're sorry his wife couldn't be with us because she has this bad knee.
Yeah, she can't get around very good.
Well, you give her our best regards. Do you have any children, Jack?
Yes, Grandpa.
Grandpa?
Yeah, we've got 2 boys.
Oh, fine.
I've got one boy with the American League catching for Washington for years, sometime back. He's too old now. He's in Wichita, Kansas.
Fine. Well, you give your wife our best regards. Ruby, you're not married, are you?
Oh, yeah.
Are you?
I'm married January 20th, 1920.
Yeah.
I married all the time. I lived the police. Oh, yeah. I married in San Francisco.
Well, we ought to get your wife down to this next meeting.
Well, yes. I don't know whether I can get her to come. She's kind of a home girl.
But she's a good cook, isn't she?
Yeah, oh boy. She's a good cook.
Joe, how about you? Are you married?
Yeah, we have 7 boys.
That's wonderful.
And 2 daughters. We had 5 sons in the armed forces at one time in World War II. We had one son that was captured on Bataan and served 3.5 years in Jap prison near Hiroshima. And was there when the shot went off and destroyed the city of Hiroshima. He was about 3 miles out from the city, and he felt the shock, and he saw the light burning for 3 days and nights, and he thought it was the Americans bombarding Hiroshima. And that...
he came through in good health, though, did he?
Oh, he broke down. He'd have died. There were some 3,500 boys in the prison, and there was only 380 got out. Oh, he said he buried several thousand.
Oh, gosh, that was a horrible thing, all right. Well, let's hope maybe more of the family can be with us next time. But number 13, number 15, is that right? Mm-hmm. Number 20, we hope we'll all get together again soon and with the other two. Do you know what the other two's numbers are?
The other two.
You know what their numbers are, do you?
No, I don't know.
I think 7 and 15, I would be certain.
We hope we have 7 and 15.
I'm
7 and
you're 15. Well, then
7 and 14 or 16.
Oliver is 12.
Well, we hope we have 7 and 12 with us next time.
I think they
you say, I believe we should make an effort of some kind when we get together. This is more for my two compadres here, to get these two fellas in on a meeting, because it don't have the right flavor. You know what I mean? The right smack. We've been together several times.
Sure.
And we're awfully sorry the other fellas can't be around.
We're all
tried, Jack. Well, you tried.
Oh, yes, I've tried.
I think...
Well, we might have to pack up and go down to Nogales or something, possibly down in Tucson.
I sent 9 letters out, and that's the time.
Well, we sure all had a wonderful time being with you, and I hope we get together real soon again. We ought to thank our little wife for sitting by and waiting patiently here for hours while we talked
I enjoyed your party last night very, very much.
Well, certainly want to pay you one compliment. You picked out a nicer crowd for an entertainment. Tried to bring one together. As far as the people who are going to we don't count. We just come along. They gave us a nice time.
Real well. We all had a good time, I'm sure.
Not you.
Come goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Good luck to you.
Goodbye.
Right, Rube. We'll see you again soon, Jack.
Bye.
All right, we'll all get together soon.
Sure, you have enjoyed listening to your stories. It was like living a real movie thriller.
That's living Arizona history. These men are living Arizona history. Like I said in my talk to the pioneers, that when you reach your middle age or mellow age, why you like to look back and feel that you've contributed something, that you've done something good for your fellow men, and certainly all you folks can feel that way, you 3 gentlemen of the Arizona Rangers, and we all owe you a debt of gratitude, certainly. And we hope we see you all again soon, too.
The people that know this history are leaving this pretty fast.
And that's right.
Oh, this last year has been many of them.
And you've got several things here today that...
Probably nobody in the world other than you 3 men. Well, fine. Well, thank you very much. We'll get together soon.
That's all right. But tell you, George, I never tell you I didn't want to be boastful. When I quit the Arizona Rangers, I was appointed a county ranger and held that for 6 years. And I worked from the Four Corners to the border of Mexico alone. Rode that line on.
That was a good territory.
And the next thing I was appointed as a special livestock detective for the sanitary board under Tom Cowman. I held that 4 years under Tom.
Well, fine. You'll have to write your memoir sometime, Joe.
Yeah.
Well, it's sure good to be with you, fellas. Let's go get a bite of lunch. What do you say?
Well, I don't care about myself. I had breakfast this morning.
C.J. Babbitt can take the credit for contributing as much to the protection of the livestock interest in Arizona as any man that ever came into it.
Well, I'm glad to know that, Rube. Thank you. Well, adios then, fellas.
We all liked him. And he apparently liked all of us.
I'm sure he did.
And he never was stingy. He overpaid you if anything. If you ever done anything for CJ, officer, citizen, or anything else, the first thing was, what do you?
Well, fine. Well, That's good. We're glad to hear that about
Well, George, take care of yourself.